It's April 21, 2005 at ADX Florence, America's Supermax prison, located deep in the Colorado mountains and also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Inmates there spend 23 hours a day in soundproof 7 by 12-foot cells designed to prevent them from making any meaningful contact with the outside world or with each other. It's where the most violent and dangerous inmates in the country are housed, and because of this, the staff takes extreme measures to ensure the prisoners' safety, including constant video surveillance, especially when they gather outside for recreation time. And on this particular day, despite everything being seemingly routine that morning, the guards noticed something odd. There in the back corner of the yard, an area surrounded by 12-foot-high concrete walls topped with razor wire, was an inmate, lying bloodied and motionless. But how could a prisoner in the most tightly controlled prison in the US get murdered in broad daylight? And even when it turned out that that murder had been caught on camera, why did it take nearly 10 years to solve? This is what we're going to find out. Jose Guadian, a guard at ADX Florence, arrived at his job watching security monitors just after 7 a.m. After his partner showed up, they ensured all the monitors were recording and then began scanning for anything suspicious. You see, rec time is where the inmates go about a lot of their illicit business. This is because inmates at ADX Florence spend almost the entire day locked up in their cells, which are built from reinforced concrete and equipped with sliding doors operated remotely by the guards. Every cell has its own narrow slit of a window, angled so that the sky is the only thing visible, preventing inmates from establishing any kind of connection to the outside world. Meals are delivered through small slots and showers are automated within the cells, all to minimize human contact and reduce the risk of violent incidents. This meant that rec time is one of their few opportunities to break the rules. Exchanging drugs, passing notes, and handing off weapons were all things Jose and his partner would be watching for. Just before 8 o'clock, the first groups of inmates began walking into the rec yard. As prisoners start doing push-ups, burpees, and other calisthenic exercises, Jose and his partner scanned the hands and the feet of the inmates, looking to see if anyone passed or dropped anything. The pair continued scanning until at 8:21 a.m. they spotted an inmate lying motionless in the far corner of the rec yard. After confirming with his partner that what they were looking at was real, the pair phoned the head of prison control, Paul Middleton. Paul immediately called a security alert. As soon as he did, every door in the prison slammed shut, except for a set that ran directly to the rec yard. With sirens blaring all around him, Paul wheeled a giant cart full of non-lethal weapons outside of his office. Every officer that ran by could grab a pepperball gun, a beanbag rifle, a baton, anything they needed to face the inmates. As guards in the facility responded and made their way into the prison yard, they didn't immediately rush in. Instead, they formed a perimeter around the yard. This is because prison rules dictated in these scenarios, guards must maintain a 3-to-1 balance of power over the inmates. The prisoners at ADX Florence are so dangerous, and with so many of them in the yard, they couldn't risk being overwhelmed. So instead, the officers began to call them one by one to walk backward toward the prison walls, where individual prisoners could then be handcuffed and brought back into their cells. Only once enough inmates had been removed like this would the ratio of guards to prisoners be high enough that officers could clear the rec yard. Medical staff, though, did immediately make their way to the downed inmate, and what they found shocked everyone. There, lying in a pool of his own blood, was an inmate who was so beaten that when medical staff tried to identify him, they couldn't, since his face was completely covered in bruises. When they attempted to identify brain functioning by shining a light in his pupils, they were unable to do so since his eyes were swollen shut. Medical staff later commented that his injuries were akin to what they had seen from people who had jumped from a nearby Royal Gorge Bridge, which was a 1,000-foot fall. Though medical staff could not get a pulse, they began CPR and they called for an ambulance. The prisoner was declared deceased at the hospital, but it is likely he died while still at the prison. As the prisoner was being transported into the hospital, though, correctional officers were busy bringing inmates to their cells, and that's when they got their first clue. Guards noticed that one of the prisoners, Richard Chuco Santiago, had blood all over his shoes. When they realized the significance of this, they came back to his cell and seized his clothing. But when they got there, Santiago was busy dunking his clothes and shoes into his prison toilet. Guards ordered him to stop, but he ignored them and started washing them faster. When threatened with a forceful extraction to stop him from destroying potential evidence, Santiago finally allowed the officers to handcuff him, and they entered his cell. As this was happening, prison officials were also reviewing the video recordings to see if the cameras had picked up anything. In ADX Florence, nearly every inch of the facility is under constant surveillance, with the video feeds running 24/7. During the video review, the officers finally discovered the identity of the victim. His name was Manuel Tati Torres, and he was a known leader of the Mexican Mafia. The tape showed Torres doing some toe touches in the back corner of the yard when two men came into the frame. The first was Santiago, the man who had been caught cleaning his clothes in his cell, and the second was another inmate named Sylvester Chicale Rivera. As Santiago approached Torres, Torres extended his hand as if to shake Santiago's, when all of a sudden Santiago cocked back his fist and punched Torres in the face. The first blow knocked him to the ground and just out of view of the camera. But Santiago and Rivera could still be seen punching, kicking, and stomping Torres for a full 6 minutes. The killers were so brazen and nonchalant about the attack that during the assault, Santiago even took a quick breather to grab a drink of water before going back in on Torres. The next day, officers went to Rivera's cell to detain him. When officers arrived, he was visibly shaking but cooperative. As he was being led away, he asked if the deputies were mad about what he did. When they didn't respond, he asked about what had happened in the rec yard yesterday, wanting to know if it was truly the first time a murder had happened at ADX Florence. "What I did," he said. "I heard it made the news." Not wanting to taint any additional statements, the corrections officers advised Rivera to stop talking and wait for the investigators to come. But who exactly were these people, how did they know each other, and why did they want to murder one of them? All three men were affiliated with the Mexican Mafia, which was born out of the cesspit that was the California Juvenile Detention Program in the 1950s. And the whole idea behind the gang was to unite Mexican-American gang members under one common banner while in jail. The gang recruited heavily and based their operation on the Italian mafias that were prominent in the American Northeast at the time. The organization had strict rules. Members had to follow all orders from made members no matter what, up to and including murder. Backing down from a fight, snitching, or trying to leave the gang were all grounds for immediate execution. And soon the gang's hyperfixation on extreme violence earned it a fearsome reputation. So much so that the California prison authorities tried to clamp down on the organization by dispersing the gang to other parts of the state. But that ended up having the opposite effect. Like a cancer, the Mexican Mafia, which was now spread out, only grew more powerful. Over the years, as members made parole, they established sects throughout California, where they continued their drug trafficking, prostitution, extortion, and murder-for-hire rackets on the outside. The Mexican Mafia, now known as La M, or the M in Spanish, became an extremely powerful gang both inside and outside the California prison system. Its core membership consisted of around 750 made members who controlled up to 50,000 associates and foot soldiers at any given time, who all had aspirations to become a full-fledged member. And the only way to do that was to commit a murder in the name of the gang. So where did these three men fall in this organization? Manuel Torres was a senior leader in the organization, first joining the gang in the 1960s. He quickly became a powerful figure in Southern California. His main racket was an extortion business that charged drug dealers and drug users a tax to buy and use drugs in his territory. He would then take a percentage of the cut and send it back to incarcerated members to help them live a more comfortable life on the inside. In 1997, Torres was one of several dozen Mexican Mafia members arrested in a giant operation. At first, Torres was sent away to do his time at Lompoc, a federal institution several hundred miles away from Los Angeles. However, once at Lompoc, Torres united all the Hispanic gangs on the yard under the banner of La M and began terrorizing the other prisoners. After running out of options to limit his power, state prison officials decided the only way to beat Torres was to ship him off to ADX Florence, where he could hopefully be controlled. As for Santiago, he was a fully made member of the Mexican Mafia and, like Torres, had also been imprisoned at Lompoc. A career criminal, Santiago earned his way into the Mexican Mafia by killing a fellow inmate in 1989, which got him a life sentence. Continuing to be unruly, he was eventually shipped off to ADX Florence in 2000, and he and Torres arrived there around the same time. Then there was Sylvester Rivera. Rivera was a longtime associate of the Mexican Mafia, a career bank robber who brought in huge sums of cash for the group, but had not been made a full member yet. After getting caught, Rivera continued to break prison rules in every institution he was at, from using drugs to making contraband wine, fighting, and trying to escape. Rivera was a problem child no matter where he went. After dealing with him for years, it was decided ADX Florence was the only place for him, and he arrived in March 2005. But even though all of these men were bad guys, it was still a homicide. The truth needed to be found out. But because the institution was federal property, the FBI would handle the investigation. And the person in charge of finding out the truth was a man who will only be known as John. In order to keep his identity a secret, John has only revealed a few details about who he was. He would later tell a reporter who investigated the case his first name, that he grew up in a very Christian southern town, and he came from a large police family. All other details had to be limited to protect himself and his family, and the reporter would soon learn why this was the case. After being assigned the case, John first went to the facility to speak to the inmates who were in the yard that day. As he made his way to the prison complex, an immense feeling of dread came over him. The complex was situated in an absolutely beautiful part of Colorado, surrounded by picturesque mountains, but the facility itself was ominous, cold, and eerily quiet. When John arrived, he asked the prison officials if they had an interview room he could use to speak to the inmates. They told him yes, they did, but no, he couldn't use it. You see, one of the worst things a prisoner can do is talk to a cop. The others see it as a betrayal, and so even the suggestion that someone had spoken to him about the murder and potentially snitched in any capacity would be enough to get them killed. John would have to come up with another way to speak with the inmates without letting the others know. To protect their confidentiality, John set up a makeshift office in a secluded part of the prison. Correction officers would take away one prisoner at a time with a made-up reason for their removal. This could be under the pretext of a doctor's appointment, a meeting with an attorney, a dental appointment, or some other mundane reason. But despite this, it didn't take long for the prisoners to figure out what was going on. One time, after several prisoners had been brought in under the guise of a dental appointment, other prisoners remarked that they didn't realize they had so many issues with their teeth. And just because they weren't talking to John in the official interrogation room, that didn't mean they would be any more cooperative. After the guards sat down the potential witnesses, many would unleash a flurry of profanities as soon as John flashed his FBI badge. Others remained even more defiant, and they refused to say a single word at all, and they would stare at John in silence until he gave up. In fact, during John's visit to ADX Florence, not a single inmate made any statement whatsoever about what happened that day, nor anything about Torres, Santiago, or Rivera. It seemed as if the entire population of several hundred inmates had either been sworn to secrecy about what happened, or they had been threatened. Either way, John realized he wasn't going to get anything out of them, and he was forced to leave ADX Florence empty-handed. But John wouldn't give up that easily. Not willing to be defeated, he teamed up with the Assistant U.S. Attorney Bob Midens, a career prosecutor who had made a name for himself in the Denver office as someone who could take on even the most complex legal cases and win. Together, he and John devised a new strategy to try to figure out what had happened, but they would need expert help to do this. The experts they chose were members of the FBI field office in Los Angeles. Here, the Intelligence Bureau had several resident experts on La M, and they knew practically all the players. When the duo met with the FBI officials in Los Angeles, they were stunned at the amount of information they had gathered on the gang. Inside the FBI office, there was a literal library of information documenting nearly every crime and every member of the group that they knew of. Not having much time, they received permission to copy most of the documents there and bring them back to Colorado for review. But that wasn't the only thing the FBI gave them there. In addition to the documents, they handed over a list of former Mexican Mafia members who had turned state witness for various trials. These former gangsters had signed their own death warrants because of this, and they were all put into the Federal Witness Protection Program. As part of the deal to help them, the FBI field office in LA gave John and Bob a list of Mexican Mafia defectors. However, they did not give them information on what they had done in their previous lives, nor did they promise their cooperation. But this was still their best shot at understanding La M and why Torres might have been marked for death. With that, John and Bob went on a countrywide tour, interviewing ex-gangsters to figure out the truth. Though many were unwilling to involve themselves, they did speak to enough people to learn the following secrets about the gang. In La M, once you're marked for death, it doesn't matter if the decision was made months, years, or even decades ago, it was still a valid order. Members marked for death never knew what was coming, and because Mexican Mafia members were spread throughout prisons in the U.S., it could take a long time for word to pass from member to member confirming the hit. Once enough members had voted for death, word could travel via messengers throughout various prisons or on the outside. Because of this, it could literally take years before a member is released to relay a message on the outside. This is because, unlike other gangs, which sometimes have documents showing written rules or orders, the Mexican Mafia keeps no records. All confidential information is locked inside one place only, the members' minds, and it is only passed by word of mouth. So what had the defectors had to say about this case in particular? What cardinal sin of La M had he broken? According to them, the reason why Torres had been marked for death was because back in the early 90s, as he was taking over his extortion business, he had killed a fellow member to have it all for himself. It took several years for other members to find out Torres was behind the murder, and by the time they did, he had already been arrested in 1997 and then shipped off to ADX Florence in 2000. So, who was Santiago? It's been claimed that he was what's known as a torpedo. Torpedoes were hitmen specifically designated to carry out assassinations of marked men inside the prison system. So, for Santiago to be sent from Lompoc to ADX Florence around the same time as Torres shows that it is very possible his murder was planned years in advance. But how did Rivera fit into all of this? Because Rivera was not yet a fully made member, he needed to commit a murder to finish his gang initiation. In addition to this, Santiago would have to receive a verbal order from outside ADX Florence to confirm the kill order and then execute it with Rivera. Based on their witnesses, John and Ryan speculated that Rivera was a messenger who brought the order to Santiago, since within 3 weeks of Rivera arriving at ADX Florence, Torres was dead. Armed with this expert testimony and the treasure trove of documents provided by the LA field office, not to mention the video of the murder itself, the pair brought a 2-count murder indictment against Santiago and Rivera in 2010. But that is where the real hard work started. Because these prisoners were already serving time in the most brutal prison in America, the U.S. attorneys wanted to send a message to dissuade other inmates from committing extreme acts of violence. But how would they convince other prisoners who had nothing else to lose? After a year of investigation, the Justice Department's Capital Crimes Unit, or Death Squad as it's known, came back with their findings. The United States would seek the death penalty against Santiago and Rivera to dissuade similar crimes in the future. But there was just one problem: Rivera was a Mexican citizen. Under the Vienna Convention, Rivera had to be apprised of his right to counsel immediately upon apprehension for the crime, which corrections officers did not do when they took him from his cell. And while this might not have seemed like a big deal, to the nation of Mexico it was, and soon the Mexican ambassador actually got involved. He wrote letters to the Attorney General and the Secretary of State about Rivera's case. Because Mexico had abolished the death penalty, trying to seek it against a Mexican citizen was a very hot-button political issue. So under political pressure, Bob announced that he would not be seeking the death penalty against Rivera, but would continue to do so against Santiago. But then disaster struck. After working on the case for years, Bob suffered a sudden heart attack while skiing with his wife and died. John took the death of someone who had now become his close friend very hard. Because of Bob's passing, John recused himself from the case. In Bob's stead, U.S. Attorney M.J. Mendez took over. But who could help? Who had the knowledge of the case needed to finish it and get the final convictions? Sometimes you don't have to look very far at all, since it turned out that John had married a fellow FBI agent. After watching her husband handle the case for years, she had become intimately familiar with it, as she had been a sounding board for her husband. With John no longer having the heart to continue after Bob's passing, his wife picked up where he left off and worked with Mendez to prepare the Rivera case for trial. But there was still a big problem. Due to the secretive nature of the Mexican mafia and the government's inability to bring their confidential informants to court, the theory that John and Bob had developed about a hit that was years in the making, while sound, was no good in court. Due to the lack of hard evidence to prove the conspiracy theory, the prosecution wanted to rely on what they could prove, namely the videotape showing the attack. As the trial kicked off, there were some extreme security measures taken to protect all of those involved from reprisals from this shadowy quasi-terrorist organization. Each of the jurors was impaneled in secret. Their faces were not shown in court, and a 4-digit number was used for their identification. As for Rivera, he was shackled to a bucket filled with concrete and flanked by numerous U.S. Marshals ready to tackle him should he try to escape or do anything out of line. But just before the trial kicked off, Rivera's defense team brought up a surprise piece of evidence: an eyewitness. Over the past 10 years, the government had not been able to procure a single statement from anyone in the yard that day. But now, all of a sudden, before the trial, the defense team had found a prisoner who was suddenly willing to testify about the attack. There was a chance he could unravel the whole case against Rivera. So, how did the government claim the murder went down? According to them, Rivera had been sitting in his cell waiting on his turn to go out into the rec yard that morning. Due to an administrative error, the guards did not take him out at the correct time, and so Rivera had flagged down a passing guard to take him out to the rec yard. Meanwhile, video footage had captured Santiago walking up to a window and talking into it. Further investigation by John using drawings of the prison had proven that Santiago had been talking into Rivera's cell while he waited to get taken outside. Once outside, the duo began warming up for their workout in the same corner as Torres, as seen in the video footage. Santiago approached Torres and cold-cocked him, and then the two spent the next 6 minutes beating him to death. But this was a vastly different story from what the new defense witness testified about. Another full-fledged Mexican mafia member named Arcadio Perez came forward as the new witness. According to Perez, this is what happened. Perez said that Torres had apparently passed him a note stating that Rivera was disrespectful and had to be dealt with, and that because Rivera was not a made member, he could kill him with impunity. Perez later testified that these were not empty threats. According to him, Torres ordered Perez that at the rec yard that morning, they were going to attack and kill Rivera. At the signal of "let's go," they would pounce on him and beat him to death right there in the yard. For his part, Perez didn't want to do it. He said that he and Rivera were friends and he honestly liked the guy. However, Torres was a ranking member in the gang. Disobeying his order would mean a death sentence for himself. But was there any truth to what he was saying? Well, maybe. According to prison records, Torres had utilized an inmate intercom system to talk to the guards that morning. Prisoners used this system since the guards didn't stay on the rec yard when they were out there. From guard testimony, Torres had been asking about where Rivera was. Because of this, it did seem odd that Torres was asking for Rivera, and the fact lends some credence to what Perez was saying. But why didn't he follow through? Perez stated that when he saw Santiago approach Torres and start fighting him, he backed off because now it was a dispute between two made members and he was not going to get himself involved. As a result of this, he stayed on the sidelines. But what did Rivera have to say about all of this? Much to everyone's surprise, Rivera took the stand in his own defense, and what he said had a ring of truth to it. According to Rivera, Torres didn't like him because he was close friends with several members Torres didn't like, likely because they were associated with the man Torres had murdered back in the early 90s. Because of this, Torres threatened Rivera's life on numerous occasions. Now, part of that does make some sense. Torres probably wanted everyone to forget about what he had done in the 90s. With several other ranking Mexican mafia members imprisoned at ADX Florence, the fact that Rivera probably knew what Torres did scared him about what would happen if Rivera began running his mouth. For his part, Rivera denied that he was a messenger who had helped organize the murder. In fact, he said he was the one defending himself. Rivera stated that Santiago took the wannabe gangster under his wing and vowed to protect him. On the day of the murder, he said that Torres had threatened his life again and wanted to fight him. However, Santiago took the initiative by using the ruse to talk to Torres, but instead started fighting him. Rivera then jumped in to help finish off Torres. In Rivera's mind, he wanted the world to believe that if he had not helped kill Torres that day, then he would be the one who ended up dead. There were two sides to the story, and so with that, the jury went off to deliberate and decide on Rivera's fate. As the two sides eagerly awaited a verdict, they returned a question to the court. The jury asked if it was permissible to consider a lesser charge than first-degree murder. This was a good sign for both camps. For the prosecutors, it meant that they believed Rivera had committed a criminal act, and for the defense, it meant a lesser charge. However, before the trial started, Rivera, against the advice of his attorneys, stated he did not want any other charge other than first-degree murder considered. This was because of his advanced age. Already in his late 50s by now, even a conviction of second-degree murder would be a de facto life sentence for him. With just a few more years left on his armed robbery convictions, Rivera was hoping to be a free man soon to enjoy his retirement. Because of that, the judge ordered that the jury could only consider a first-degree murder charge and nothing else. Soon after that, the verdict came back. As the aged gangster rose to hear his fate, he had a slight smile on his face as he anticipated an acquittal. But that smile soon faded when he heard the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. It had taken years, but they finally got their man when the jury delivered a guilty verdict. And for a bit of poetic justice, the verdict came almost exactly 10 years to the day after the murder had taken place. When the jury members were questioned later as to how they reached their decision, they said that if the case were really about self-defense, why would Rivera and Santiago keep kicking and stomping Torres even after he was down? After the first few minutes, their point would have been made to back off. Everything afterward was unnecessary. Several months after Rivera's conviction, he learned of his fate. For the crime of first-degree murder, he would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. Of course, Rivera maintained his innocence at the time and continues to maintain his innocence to this day, claiming it was a self-defense case. But what about his co-defendant? In order to avoid the death penalty, Santiago skipped the trial and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in December 2016. He was soon also given an additional life sentence without parole. But despite the convictions, there were no winners here. Even though Torres was himself a monster, he was still a father with children and other family members who loved him. For him to meet such a violent end served no justice to either his own family or the family of his victims, since he had not been sentenced to death for his crimes. As for the police, despite obtaining convictions for the two killers, the FBI became no closer to taking down higher-ranking members of the Mexican Mafia for this murder. Due to the intense secrecy surrounding the group, even nearly 10 years of investigating yield no fruitful returns other than keeping two lower-level criminals behind bars for good. Unfortunately, it'll take much more police work, more crimes, and a good bit of luck to truly dismantle the Mexican Mafia for good in the future. It's 2023. You're a hardened member of Mara Salvatrucha, better known as the infamous MS-13, and the government of El Salvador has just sentenced you to a fate worse than death. You're forced like cattle into the back of a heavily armored vehicle. Tightly packed flesh covered in gang tattoos holds you in place. There's barely space in this scorching vehicle for you and the others to breathe. The guards stripped you and gave you an uncomfortable cavity search, leaving you violated and humiliated in nothing but a pair of white shorts. An unsympathetic police barber shaved you bald, row by row of hair, just like all the others. If you raise your head in transit, a guard barks at you in Spanish to get your head down, you worthless dog. He wields his nightstick. You get the impression that there's nothing he'd like more than cracking open the back of your skull, flecking the naked skin of your fellow prisoners with your blood, just to send a simple message. Where you're going, you're not considered human anymore. You're an animal, and when animals misbehave, they get put down. You bow your head again, a wise choice. There will be plenty of beatings later, so why start early? But before you disappear back into the sea of anonymous prisoners, you see it. A glowing fortress, wreathed in barbed wire and illuminated by piercing floodlights. It makes Alcatraz look like Disneyland. It makes Rikers look like a resort in Cancun. Hell, after a few years here, Guantanamo Bay would look like a health retreat. This is the Centro de Confinamiento de Terrorismo, or the Terrorism Confinement Center. We'll call it CCOT. You won't find another prison like this anywhere in the world. But you're not being sent here alone. There are trails of buses in front and behind you, like almost some endless centipede of human misery. You're just one tiny percentage point in a statistic, a tidal wave of 2,000 prisoners, all being transferred at once, all as part of El Salvador's sweeping efforts to bring the country's gang activity to its knees. At its worst in 2011, El Salvador was considered the murder capital of the world, peaking at 71 murders per 100,000. In 2015, that number had risen to over 100 deaths per 100,000. One day even saw 62 people murdered in 24 hours. Gang violence had completely overtaken the Central American country. Year after year, brutal gang warfare saw the army roaming the streets just to keep the country from falling into total collapse. The government needed to take drastic measures. You're about to enter one of those drastic measures. Opened in 2022, very few people have had the chance to see inside CCOT, aside from the flood of prisoners being sent there, including you. The media are not allowed in. Lawyers are not allowed in. Human rights groups are not allowed in. It's closed down almost entirely to the outside world. All that civilians know about the facility has been gleaned from satellite imagery and footage that the El Salvador government has filmed and released. The buses grind to a halt in a large grid outside the prison. Some deep animal part of you feels like you're outside of a slaughterhouse, and your skin begins prickling with panic. You were a bad dude on the outside. A robber, a killer, an unquestioning enforcer of one of El Salvador's most feared gangs. Here, you're a frightened little child again, wishing for your mommy. But you don't get your mommy. You get manhandled out of a bus by huge men in riot gear, clapping you in long cuffs that bind your hands behind your back and connect to your legs. The same thing's happening to hundreds, then thousands of other men around you. You feel a nightstick press against the back of your neck and instinctively bend over before they can even start applying pressure. Good boy, that'll serve you well here. The guards bark orders and corral you inside like sheep. Of course, you obey. You and all the others are practically naked, and even if you manage to overpower one of the riot squad guards specifically trained to beat you into a fine puree, an expert sniper in one of the nearby guard towers would put a round through your head before you even had time to fart. Right now, there are estimated to be around 16,000 men in Sikat. That would max out most prisons around the world. The second largest prison in the world, Silivri Penitentiary's campus in Turkey, manages to host a population of around 22,000 inmates. Sikat is built to double that, with a capacity of 40,000. Even getting to the prison is a challenge. President Nayib Bukele wanted to build it far away from civilization. There are no towns or cities nearby, no public buildings or schools. The prison itself has its own water supply and electric generators, meaning it has even less need to connect with anyone or anything external. That's why you spent so many hours roasting with your fellow convicts in the back of that prison bus. As you're dragged into the main hall and forced to boy down in lines for inspection, you find yourself wondering how one prison complex could hold so many people. And the answer to that is simple. It is unimaginably huge. There are 8 prison blocks covering around 57 acres in total, but the plot of land for the prison is an enormous 410 acres in total. There are 19 guard towers perched high above the complex, surveying everything. There are 4 layers of walls surrounding the prison blocks. Each one is nearly 10 feet tall and 2 feet thick, with coils of barbed wire draped over the top. And, of course, you can't forget about the 15,000-volt electric fence, too. Surveillance cameras are in operation 24/7, and they cover practically every square inch of the facility. Nothing happens off camera. Should a riot break out, they have a fully stocked armory with racks and racks of firearms, as well as heavy riot gear for their guards. Even the U.S. Army would have a hard time storming Sikat. And you are just a common thug for hire. You've got no hope, buddy. So what have you got to look forward to now that you're here? When you first arrive, prisoner or not, you're subject to an intense screening process. Even if you're not an inmate, the guards at Sikat have large X-ray machines that scan you from head to toe to look for contraband. You'll also be asked to disclose any tattoos, and if you don't, they have the right to strip you to check themselves. The gangs in El Salvador have a culture of tattooing their members to cement their allegiance for life. If you've got gang ties, you're not getting in unless it's in handcuffs and white shorts. Once you've been scanned, searched again, beaten down, and noted in the prison inventory, it's time for your first night at Sikat to begin. Part of you feels relieved that you'll finally be able to sleep after what's felt like the longest day of your life. But we've got some bad news for you there, too. The guards organize into groups by cell block and chase you, your hands on your head and your back bowed over. If you lag behind, you might take a nightstick to the spine or the ankle, or feel the electric burn of a stun gun on your bare skin. They run you like the bulls of Pamplona until you reach your cell, at which point a swift kick to your ass sends you tumbling in. The reinforced metal door slamming behind you once all the others assigned to the cell have been trapped in there too. This is when you start to notice a number of horrifying things about your new home. For starters, the lights are always on. They don't switch off at night. They don't even dim them. They're on 24/7 full blast. Bright, harsh artificial lights flood every communal cell. There are 80 beds to a cell. We say beds, but they have no mattresses or bedding on them. Instead, they're harsh bunk bed frames, stacked 4 high, with nothing to lie on but flat metal. In the corners of the cells, right by the bars, are 2 toilets. Next to them are 2 wash basins, but the flow of the water in these is controlled by a guard outside the cell. So that's 80 prisoners in a cell sharing just 2 toilets. Except it isn't. It seems that El Salvador is actually cramming more than 80 in each cell. We hope you don't mind having plenty of roommates. When a BBC reporter asked the director of the prison exactly what the capacity of Sikat was, the man smiled and said, "Where you can fit 10 people, you can fit 20. Can you imagine a worst night's sleep? Being in a brightly lit cell with over 100 other people, all the most hardened gangsters in Central America, lying on a metal sheet with 2 shared toilets stinking out the cell. Human rights groups have estimated that prisoners in Sikat have just 0.6 square meters of personal space each. That number falls far below the 4 square meters mandated in the European Union. There are solitary confinement cells too, and to many that might be preferable, but they've got their trade-offs too. Instead of a metal bed frame, you have a slab of concrete to lie on. You get 1 toilet, 1 wash basin, and while the communal cells are always bathed in artificial light, you have the opposite problem: no light at all. either artificial or natural, meaning you just have to sit in the darkness all day stewing in your own thoughts. And at CCOT, one thing is for sure, you're not having pleasant thoughts. Before we tell you about the horrors that await you when you wake up in the morning, we've got an important question to answer. Why does El Salvador need such a massive prison? Who are the men arriving here, and when will they leave? We mentioned earlier a particular day in El Salvador when 62 people were killed. This was the 26th of March 2022. It was the bloodiest day in the country's history and the final straw for the Salvadoran people. President Bukele announced a radical new approach to combating gang warfare. Having been elected largely for his tough stance on gangs back in 2019, it was time for him to put his money where his mouth was. His plan was a sweeping raft of changes that removed almost all of the barriers preventing the police from arresting gang members. Known as the Régimen d'Exception, it was a national state of emergency. The changes affected almost every stage of the legal system. Criminals no longer had access to legal counsel, and they could be held 5 times longer without charges. Options like bail and house arrest were removed, and police could now monitor civilian communications without the need for a warrant. Sentences were also massively increased. Previously convicted gang lords would get 6 to 9 years in prison. That shot up to 40 to 45. Lower gang members saw their potential sentences rise from 3 to 5 years up to 20 to 30. Even if you were caught sharing gang-related information, you could end up behind bars for 15 years. One of the ways that gangs all around the world have avoided long prison sentences has been by using children and teenagers for the risky legwork. A young teenager can be easily manipulated. What's more, they'll get a lenient sentence and be out sooner, so they're an expendable workforce for the gang leaders to use as shields. Not anymore. El Salvador lowered the age for criminal responsibility from 16 to 12. That's right, actual 12-year-olds could get locked up for decades for their roles in gangs. Soldiers and heavily armed police swarmed the streets looking for any trace of evidence that somebody was gang-affiliated. They would raid houses indiscriminately and set up security checkpoints on almost every major road. Anyone passing through the checkpoint would not only need to provide a photo ID and proof of address, but also demonstrate a valid reason for travel. Their cars would be searched from top to bottom. If the people manning the checkpoints even suspected a person could have ties to gangs, they would ask that person to strip them and then search their body for any gang tattoos. This policy was massively supported up and down the country. 78% of Salvadorans strongly support the crackdown. A staggering 91% of them are in favor. That's just 9% of the country that is neutral or anti-crackdown. The measures were only supposed to last for 30 days, but here we are well over 2 years later, and they're still in place. And that's because consistently every month, parties across the government of El Salvador vote to extend them. So far, over 79,000 people have been arrested for gang affiliation. In a country of just 6.5 million people, that's over 1% of the population being detained in just 2 years. It is a monumental shift, and one that's brought its own set of challenges. The Salvadoran prison system was not designed to house this many criminals. Nowhere close. Prisons all around the country quickly filled to capacity. When the question of funding came up, Nayib Bukele drew a hard line that only won him more favor. He would not take funding away from schools, hospitals, or good public services to feed the prisoners. Instead, their meals went down from 3 to 2 per day, consisting of just beans and tortillas. But a longer-term solution was needed, one that Bukele was already prepared for: CCOT, a brand new 40,000 capacity prison miles away from civilization, a proverbial hole in the ground where they could throw the country's gangs and let them fester. You know, that same hole in the ground where you're currently festering. So let's head back there and see how your evening is going, shall we? You don't know what time you wake up. The harsh lights overhead didn't let you sleep in the first place. The constant talking, shouting, and fighting through the night kept you from drifting off for more than a few minutes at a time. At one point, one of the tougher guys shoved you out of the bed that he wanted, and you fell 8 feet onto the concrete floor. It's down here you decided to spend the rest of the night. Rather than risk getting shivved for something only marginally more comfortable, you're desperate to go to the bathroom, but there's not much you can do. One toilet in your cell has been blocked for 2 weeks now, and the other got blocked over the weekend. They'll probably call in a plumber sometime in the next year or two. A guy shoves you in the back and you crack your head against the bunk frame. It's an early lunch today. Plastic trays loaded with cost-saving beans and tortillas, with sickly boiled eggs on the side, are passed through the bars one by one. You join near the back of the line and you have to eat your cold food on the floor. They never give out cutlery. The forks and knives could be used as weapons, so you have no choice but to eat with your hands. A lot of the guys in the cells have pretty poor hand hygiene, especially with the toilet situation, so stomach viruses are common, which has in turn made the toilet situation even worse. You've avoided getting sick so far, but it's only a matter of time. Before you've even had a chance to eat your nasty egg, everyone's up and moving again. It's time for your 30 minutes. Lucky you. Every day you get to spend half an hour outside. It's easily the best part of the day as long as the handcuffs aren't done up too tight. As expected, the guard takes a dislike to you and pinches the shackles extra tight today. You feel it chafe the skin of your wrists with every movement you take. You and your 100 cellmates shuffle meekly out into the sweltering sun for your exercise. Some guys try to do push-ups, some halfway run around best they can with their ankles chained, and most just sit against the fence breathing in the fresh air. And it's over before you know it. Bundled back inside by the guards, the excitement of your day is over before it's even 11 a.m. Not that you know that. Time is long gone. Every day blends into the next, and most of them are spent how you are spending your time now, sitting around on either a hard bunk or hard concrete, doing nothing. Every 5 days you get your head shaved. In the 4 days in between, you usually have nothing to do, the boredom slowly turning your brain as soft and cold as those revolting eggs. The fights are the only interesting part of the day. The guards usually let the prisoners settle their own differences, not worth wading into a cell with 100 angry prisoners just to stop one criminal from getting his face smashed in. Worst comes to worst, they'll flood the cell with tear gas, send in the riot squad, and drag out the corpse. Everything else was considered a waste of prison resources. You think about your family. You never got to say goodbye to any of them. It all happened so quickly. 1 minute you were sitting on your couch, the next the military police were kicking down your door and hauling you away. Does your mother know where her son is? Does your daughter understand that her dad loves her? Will she think you just abandoned her? Will your younger brother see sense and choose a different life? Or is he in the next cell block over from you right now, going through the exact same thing? While CCOT is immensely popular in El Salvador and has indisputably helped the country get on top of gang violence, you cannot ignore the glaring human rights violations. So far, not one person who has been sent to CCOT has been released. Inmates arriving here face the very real possibility that they will live out the rest of their days stuck here, without ever getting a hypothetical release date to hope for. Human rights campaigners accuse it of being the death penalty on a mass scale, minus the injections, nooses, or electrical shocks. With so many thousands of prisoners being apprehended without access to proper legal counsel, there inevitably will be a significant proportion of innocent men behind bars. That happens even in the best justice systems in the world. But in one where convicts' rights have been eroded to the point of almost non-existence, it's likely happening alarmingly often. The lack of access to the prison is also a massive red flag. Journalists, lawyers, and NGOs are all either denied access or taken around in very focused, controlled circumstances where the guards do their best to show off the prison to the world. The prisoners themselves have no access to the outside world. They're not allowed to make phone calls or send letters like in other prisons around the globe. They live totally cut off from the rest of humanity. There is a reason for this. In countries overrun with gang warfare, prisons can end up being pretty ineffective. Gang leaders locked away can often still call the shots from behind bars thanks to burner phones that get smuggled in by visitors, new inmates, or corrupt guards. The black market in prison can become a hotbed of crime as drugs, weapons, and other contraband are exchanged freely amongst inmates. To a large extent, gangs can continue to operate in and through the prison system, but not in CCOT. As extreme as the measures are, they have snuffed out communications among gang leaders, locked them away, and they're dead to the world, leaving a power vacuum in their wake. Inside the prisons, without a thriving black market, they can't disrupt and control things the way they once did. They've lost their power. Some of that comes down to the way the guards are treated too. Bukele himself admits that El Salvador had made mistakes in how they treated their guards previously. Prisons run by gangs saw many inmates living in more luxury than the guards themselves, as they'd enjoy a free flow of drugs, prostitutes, and alcohol, while the guards were working long shifts in terrible conditions, and bribery was rampant. But now Bukele has made sure to treat the guards much better. CCOT has great recreational facilities for its staff. They have gyms, lounges, and much better working conditions. There are 1,000 guards, 600 soldiers, and 250 police officers working on site. That works out at 40 inmates per guard, a high ratio, But when you consider how many of those inmates are packed into just one cell, you can see how much more power the guards now have. They monitor everything. They control everything. The inmates have no power anymore. Your flight takes off. As it climbs into the rising sun, you wonder, is the in-flight meal chicken or fish? But guess what? It doesn't matter. You're not actually on the flight. No, you're on a new journey, a different kind of trip. You did the crime, and now it's time to do the time in Japanese prison. Now as you're led down the hallway to your new home for the next 2 years, fear sets in. Japan's prison system operates on strict rules and a vastly different culture than the US, and you have no idea what's in store. Is this going to be one of those nightmare scenarios of an American in a foreign jail, or could it actually be as nice and clean as the hotel you stayed in? It's time to experience your first 24 hours in a Japanese prison on this episode of The Infographic Show. Okay, so ignoring those customs instructions might not have been your best move. Let's just say your attempts to bring a few souvenirs back from visiting family in Japan didn't go unnoticed. It was probably the Japanese flying squirrels in your suitcase that raised a few eyebrows. But hey, your girlfriend wanted a real souvenir, and plushies just weren't cutting it. Turns out trying to be a good boyfriend doesn't fly in court. Now you're headed up the river. American citizens arrested abroad often get a hand from their government. But Japan has a justice system with a solid reputation, so don't expect a diplomatic rescue. Besides, you definitely, absolutely did it. You have no idea what to expect. Well, that's not quite true. Unlike the American prison system, the Japanese penal system is very strictly regulated and overseen. Japanese pretrial detention is fairly fast-paced and efficient. Suspects are detained for up to 48 hours unless an extension is requested. You pled guilty because they pretty much caught you dead to rights smuggling, and you were hoping for leniency. But the judge wasn't feeling it that day. It was all over pretty quickly, and your fate was determined. And then it was off to school. One of the most unique elements of the Japanese prison system is that before you go, you're placed in an orientation program that lasts 15 days. During this time, you're not in the general population, and you spend most of your time being briefed on the rules and the schedule of your new life. It feels more like a military academy than a prison so far, but you're worried that that's about to change. And that's because you're headed to one of the most infamous and largest penitentiaries in Japan, Fuchu Prison. Most of the inmates here are in for the long haul, 10 years or more. You quickly realize you're one of the few serving a relatively light sentence. But that doesn't make things any easier in a place like this. As you're escorted out of the orientation quarters and led toward the general population in Fuchu Prison, you're immediately struck by the sheer scale of the place. With over 1,200 inmates and a capacity of more than 2,700, this facility is packed. And you're just one face among the almost 60 nationalities housed here, many of which have past prison records. When you first came in, you went through a search, but now it's time for round 2. A much more intense search to ensure you're not bringing in any well-hidden contraband. This time, the Japanese guards conduct the search with a precision that feels almost rehearsed. Bend over and cough. This isn't your first time in a holding cell, so it's not your first time getting a full search. The Japanese guards seem more in control of the situation than the American guards did when they caught you joyriding in your dad's truck. They gave you clear instructions and they didn't have to make threats. But from the steely look in their eyes, you get the distinct impression that you had better obey very carefully. You've already given up your possessions at intake, and you'll get them back when you're released. Well, except for the squirrels. So now it's time to meet the company. You watched plenty of prison dramas over the years, so you're expecting the worst. Will they be chanting "new fish" in Japanese? You saw some of your fellow new prisoners in the orientation, but there was no chance for interaction. Silence was required all around. You don't know whether they're ordinary schlubs like you or hardened criminals. As you're led down the hallway to your cell, you wait for outbursts of violence and threats, but they don't come. In fact, the entire place is a little too quiet for your tastes. But you're going to be getting a lot of company very soon. The biggest shock you get is when you arrive at your cell. This isn't a standard cell with bars and 2 cots for you and your cellie to bicker over. Rather, it's a stark room that looks more like a ward in a mental hospital or a military barracks. And the other big surprise is how many people are in it. 6. Most prisoners in Japan are held in communal cells, although high risk and some foreign prisoners are held separately. As you're a non-violent prisoner without any political complications to your case, and you speak Japanese, you suppose they decided you're suitable for the general population. You look around and your roommates look like a combination of Japanese prisoners and foreign ones. prisons in Japan are far more segregated than prisons in the US and many other countries. That means you're not going to be housed with the most hardcore prisoners. They're gathered by the type of penalty, the length of sentence, and how dangerous they're seen as to the guards and other prisoners. And that means you're likely to be housed with other non-violent criminals, many of whom are first-time offenders. And from a look at the faces around you, they've all been through this procedure a few times before. Haruto has wound up here for a 10-year stint due to a series of high-value robberies. Kenji was involved with a gang riot as a young man and is more than halfway through a 6-year sentence. Akihiko is the oldest inmate here and was caught running an elaborate insider trading ring and is serving 5 years. Daichi was on the lookout for his older brother during an armed robbery and got 4 years after cooperating with the police. And Jürgen is a German tourist whose vacation in Japan was extended by 7 years after being caught with drugs. It's kind of like a camp bunk, only a lot more miserable. So you puff up your chest and say, "Yeah, I was caught in a smuggling ring. Got 2 years." They don't need to know about the squirrels. Now you all know each other's crimes and they all seem fine, but a part of you is still worried. There isn't a lot of space here and you're sure you're going to get on each other's nerves. You remember sharing a bedroom with 5 cousins at Christmas. It was a total brawl within hours. How long until this place turns into a Japanese smackdown tournament? Months, weeks, or maybe you're already in it. People do step out of line in Japanese prisons, and they usually regret it. In American prisons, the guards feel omnipresent. You remember being woken up by them banging their nightsticks on the bars. Felt like they wanted someone to screw up so they could make an example of them. But here they almost blend into the background, and that's because good behavior is expected here. They drilled this into you repeatedly during orientation. The prison runs on a military-style system of discipline, with everyone wearing the same uniform and following a very strict schedule. And like in the military, you rise together or you fall together. The reason Japanese prisons house inmates together is because, to a large degree, the discipline here is enforced not by the guards, but by fellow inmates. If one inmate steps out of line, the whole cell could lose privileges, so it is fairly common for the 5 inmates who aren't plotting anything to report misbehavior. Or it might be quicker to intimidate their wayward roommate back into the straight and narrow. So, in some ways, you don't have 5 roommates, you have 5 more experienced guards who are not going to let you pull any funny business. But you might not have the time for funny business. One of the biggest culture shocks about Japanese prison is that everything is structured down to the minute. While in American prison, boredom was your biggest enemy, your cellmate didn't like it when you started whistling your favorite songs from The Simpsons, here you're going to be kept very busy. It starts only a short time after you've been brought to your cell for the first time and met your roommates. Only a few minutes later, a guard is knocking on your cell door and everyone inside snaps to attention. It's time for roll call. The guards briskly take notes that everyone is here, dressed, and ready for their day to begin. Everyone quickly snaps to attention, and even though it takes you a few more seconds, it's not noticed. You're led down the hall because it's chow time. As a foreign prisoner in Japan, you had a few choices to make, including your diet inside. Foreign prisoners are given the choice of a rice-based diet or a bread-based diet more suited to Western tastes. Vegetarian and halal options are also available, but this is a one-way choice. No switching later on, except in extenuating circumstances. You actually chose to have the standard diet because you didn't know about the quality of special requests. And this is another surprise right out of the gate. It's not terrible. Japanese prisons are controversial for a lot of reasons, but the food is not one of them. They're actually considered to have one of the best prison diets in the world, certainly better than the United States. Meals are carefully designed for suitable nutrition and calorie needs and have a good variety. It's not always pleasure. For breakfast, you're served a simple meal of rice, fish, and pickled vegetables. It certainly is the furthest thing from the McGriddle you're craving right now, but it does the job. And it had better because it's work time. You won't have time to get bored in Japanese prison because you'll be busy doing your new job. What's that? Whatever the prison sees fit. While prison labor is common across the world, including in the US, it serves 2 purposes in Japan. The goal is to keep the inmates occupied, teach them useful skills, and produce goods. Some of the common trades taught in prison include auto repair, carpentry, woodworking, leather work, typography, and dry cleaning. These are in-house assignments, although inmates who are serving longer sentences and have had time to build trust may be outsourced to factories to complete their labor. And it is not optional. While you're locked up, you'll be working a full 8-hour day in prison, and for your initial assignment, you'll be in woodworking. You're given a quick tutorial on the patterns you'll be making, as well as the machine you'll be using. Seems easy enough to master, and you'll be doing it a lot. You get confused a few times and have some pieces have to be thrown away, but you figure you shouldn't be asking for any help. Everyone here looks pretty plugged in. It's been a long day. At least it's already 9 a.m. At 9:45, it's time for a quick break. You're able to get something to drink, stretch your legs, and relax all under the watchful eye of your guards. Before you know it, the signal rings again, and it's back to work. This is the second part of your shift, and you'll be working until noon. It's boring work, but it's manageable. But one of the most surprising parts of it is how utterly quiet it was. When you were doing work in detail during one of your stays in Juvie Hall, the kids were constantly chatting and arguing. The shouts of "back to work" by the guards were even louder. Not here. Everyone is working in unison, barely making a peep. And after what feels like forever, it's time for another break. You're headed for lunch, and you're actually a little excited by what awaits you. You're getting the impression that food might be one of the few highlights of your time here. Think of it as your own Japanese restaurant experience, if you couldn't leave and the chef just picked out whatever looked interesting that day. Your hands are starting to ache after the first part of your shift, and you could use the energy. It's a simple plate of teriyaki chicken and a mildly sweet sauce with some grilled vegetables and more rice. It's enjoyable enough, but you're starting to miss a Philly cheesesteak. However, you suspect that that was not one of the offerings on the bread-based menu. From there, it's time to return to work, but you're in for a surprise. As it's your first day and your responses to quizzes about your aptitude in orientation was, I don't know, the management's decided to switch you around. You suspect that your reaction time in woodworking was a little too slow, so they decided to switch you into auto repair, where you'll be working with a team. Your job here is more familiar. You've changed plenty of tires in your day, and your assembly line is soon a well-oiled machine. Under the watchful eye of the guards, of course, you have a feeling you'll be fine here, because you'll be doing this a lot. You were briefed by your duties in orientation, and this is essentially a full-time job. You'll be working 8 hours a day, Monday through Friday, and 4 hours on Saturday. For this, you'll be paid a mighty sum of around $30 a month, which will be held in escrow for you. Hey, at least it's something, and you're not paying for room and board. In many ways, it hasn't really sunk in for you that you're in prison. You haven't spent much time in a cell, and you're being kept busy. Your cellmates seem okay too. And now it's time for dinner. There's a sense of novelty to what you're getting from this different culture. Dinner fits into a similar pattern. It's a pork katsu cutlet, which is kind of like a schnitzel with a lighter breading, with steamed vegetables and of course a decent portion of rice. It tastes good, but you get the feeling that you're going to become very familiar with these dishes over the next 2 years. They're all designed to give you a combo of major food groups suited to the Japanese diet, and there is a reason they call it a rice-based diet. Now it's time for what you've been looking forward to all day, some time off. Your work detail is done for the day, so you return to your cell. For well-behaved inmates, this is the one time of the day when some brief tastes of comfort and relaxation are allowed. Unlike in American prisons, there isn't much emphasis on outdoor exercise. After all, you've been working for most of the day, so instead this is essentially quiet time. Inmates have access to television and radio during this period, assuming they can agree what to watch or listen to. You're letting your cellmates pick this time. You don't want to make any waves. Besides, you got your own entertainment. Before being officially taken in, you're given the chance to select up to 10 books for entertainment. You managed to get most of your picks, though a few were vetoed and for being a bit too spicy for prison standards. Turns out the prison has a strict ban on anything deemed pornographic or detrimental to public morale. You're also briefed on some upcoming enrichment activities, from group exercise hours to motivational talks on bouncing back after prison. One thing is clear, the prison is designed to rehabilitate you, or at least that's the plan. And you're going to learn stuff whether you like it or not. There are a few catches to your recreation here, like the fact that everything has to be done in Japanese. You're really lucky that you listened to your mom's Japanese lessons growing up, although some accommodations are allowed for foreign prisoners who are in their own units. You see, Jürgen has books in German, although he seems to know enough Japanese to converse with the other inmates. Now to settle in and unwind from a long and confusing first day in prison. Well, at least you would if it wasn't for the shouting from down the hall. You sit up with a start and watch as a young Japanese man is roughly dragged down the hall by several guards, struggling to get free. The illusion of order has been shattered, but none of your fellow inmates look startled. Daiichi just mutters under his breath, "Looks like another couldn't handle it." and everyone else nods. You get the feeling that they've all had their own brushes with the guards, well, except for maybe Akihiko, who looks like he really wants to get back to his corner office. But the younger inmates can tell you don't know what awaits the unfortunate inmate, and they can't wait to tell you. It's scary story time. The thing about Japanese prison is it's peaceful and tightly regimented. There is plenty of opportunities for growth and learning, if you keep to the straight and narrow. The second you veer from the schedule, the system comes down on you like a ton of bricks. For inmates who disrupt the order, punishment often means solitary confinement in a protection cell, supposedly for those posing a risk to themselves or others. This typically involves heavy restraints, handcuffs, and intense isolation. Multiple organizations have raised concerns that Japan's reliance on such extreme measures to keep order may be edging into civil rights violations. And you might be one of the lucky ones. Daichi hasn't had much interaction with his brother since the older robber got 15 years. But what communication he had with him indicates that you guys have it easy. Violent criminals are definitely not treated with kid gloves in Japan. Time out of the cell is much more limited, routine is more strictly regimented, and high-security inmates are often heavily isolated. For death row cases, the inmates live in near total isolation and don't even know when their execution will be. You picked up that little detail from an episode of your favorite YouTube channel. Maybe it should have given you a hint to stay out of prison here. And you really don't want to wind up having a close encounter with the guards of your own. You hear a slam of a door down the hall, and you know you probably won't be hearing from that one inmate for a little while. If he pulls himself together, he'll probably be back on the main floor soon enough. If not, he could find himself upgraded to a higher level of security full-time. Suddenly your cell feels a little smaller, and the book that you've been reading no longer holds much interest. This is the first time you've had all day to really be alone with your thoughts, and your situation is weighing on you. Your first day in a Japanese prison is just about over, and the next one will likely be almost exactly the same. Routine is king in Japanese prison, and for those who want to get through their sentence, it's best to learn the routine fast. Now, you've just got to do this about 729 more times. That's a whole lot of rice. Could you handle the strict rules of a Japanese prison? What do you think would be the hardest part of the first 24 hours inside? For Nicolas Cochon, murdering his cellmate wasn't the end of his crime, it was only the beginning. After repeatedly stabbing Thierry Baudry with a pair of scissors and suffocating him with a garbage bag, Nicolas wasn't done. What followed was something out of a horror story. Using a smuggled razor blade, he sliced off pieces of Baudry's flesh, still warm, before cooking them on a camping stove with sautéed onions. And then he ate them as though he was in a fine dining restaurant. Oh, and one more detail, he was French. And if you can believe it, this is somehow one of the less insane people we're going to cover in today's video. Grab your shiv and watch your back, because on today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're going inside to look at the world's most dangerous prison inmates. Number 15. Nicolas Cochon. This despicable act of prison violence took place in 2007, earning Nicolas Cochon the nickname the Cannibal of Rouen. What started this argument that led to a brutal act of cannibalism? A disagreement about the state of the prison toilets. That's why you don't leave the seat up, folks. According to Mr. Cochon, he made multiple requests for psychiatric help from the prison staff, fearing that he might be violent. No one was listening to me, he said. I made several appeals for help, saying I was a man capable of being dangerous. I took action and then they took me seriously. We don't think anyone can deny that he proved his point. Let's look at another horrific act of prison murder and mutilation. Number 14. Michael Hernandez. Michael Hernandez was a man who didn't take things lightly, and when it comes to dealing with his cellmate, his response was anything but ordinary. His victim was 58-year-old Larry Mark, who was doing time in a prison 47 miles north of Gainesville, Florida, on a first-degree murder charge. Larry had made plenty of mistakes in his life, but none as fatal as the last one, allegedly pestering Hernandez. Crucially, Hernandez was already serving a life sentence for his crimes, with little possibility of parole. That meant he had nothing to lose and a lot to gain in do not mess with me prison cred. He had murdered an elderly woman during a home invasion, and during his sentencing for that crime, he had further charges lumped on for threatening to murder the president. Clearly not the kind of guy you want annoyed at you, but Larry was jaded, having been in jail since 1982. In 2018, when Larry Mark pushed Hernandez a little too far, Hernandez pulled out a prison shank and stabbed his roomie to death. But it didn't end there. Hernandez had a flair for the theatrical, so he also rolled up Mark's body in a sheet, cut off one of his ears, and then made it into a pendant. When Hernandez walked into the mess hall for breakfast proudly wearing Mark's dangling severed ear around his neck, the guards suddenly became aware of what had happened. Hernandez was given another life sentence for his crime, which is great because clearly the first life sentence did wonders in curbing his more violent tendencies. Speaking of terrifying killer inmates who seem to have a lifelong grudge against eyes, let's head on over to the British Isles for the life and crimes of Gary Vinter, another man who was just seemingly addicted to violence. Number 13. Gary Vinter. Vinter was first sent to prison in 1996 after murdering his colleague, Carl Eden. He'd stabbed Carl 37 times, puncturing every single one of his organs. He was imprisoned only to be released almost 10 years later in 2005. To the surprise of no one, he almost immediately went back to prison for his part in a pub brawl. Sadly, Gary was just getting started. He was released again in 2008, being considered a model prisoner. He would not be considered that for long. He stabbed his ex-wife to death in his own mother's home, sending him straight back to the big house. In 2011, he had a brutal altercation with child killer Roy Whiting. Gary used the sharpened handle of a toilet brush to mutilate Roy, earning him an indefinite sentence. And he still wasn't done. In 2014, Gary attacked another lifer, another man with 2 murders to his name, Lee Newell. The attack destroyed one of Lee's eyes and left him with a traumatic brain injury. And what motivated this attack? Well, Gary wasn't happy with the prison's gym facilities. He thought that if he murdered another inmate, he might get transferred to a facility with a better gym. Sometimes the reason for a murder can be every bit as horrible as the murder itself. Number 12. Jackson Vogel. This was definitely the case for 24-year-old Jackson Vogel. Vogel's prejudices drove him to brutally murder his 19-year-old cellmate, Micah Loreno, in Wisconsin's Green Bay Correctional Institution. Micah was serving a year in jail for being party to a substantial battery, but according to everyone who knew him, a good kid with potential who had just fallen in with the wrong crowd. Vogel? Not so much. He was serving a 40-year sentence for the attempted murder of his own mother. He stabbed her repeatedly, strangled her, and even tried to snap her neck. You can already see the problem with placing these two inmates together. On August 27, 2024, a guard making his regular patrols found that Vogel had placed a piece of paper over the window into their cell. When the guard told Vogel to remove the piece of paper, he suddenly saw Micah's corpse hanging from the top of their bunks, his ankles and wrists tied with orange material. He had been tortured and strangled to death, an act which Vogel described as, quote, ecstasy. When Vogel was removed from the cell during the murder investigation, authorities uncovered more than they expected. Alongside strips of orange fabric used to bind Micah, they found a chilling piece of paper scrawled with the words, "Kill all humans." The note was littered with expletives, targeting black and gay people, painting a disturbing picture of Vogel's state of mind. And yet, somehow, Jackson Vogel seemed like a model citizen compared to our next contestant. Number 11. Jamie Osuna. Jamie Osuna is a self-proclaimed Satanist killer who the media nicknamed the Man of 1,000 Faces for his extensive series of face tats. He was first arrested for the horrific torture and murder of single mother Yvette Pena, which he took a great deal of pride in. Going to prison didn't help mellow Jamie out. In fact, it only made him more violent and creative. His cellmate in Corcoran State Prison, 44-year-old Luis Romero, met a horrific end in 2019. When Osuna decided to turn him into a grisly arts and crafts project while the guards were looking the other way. Using smuggled weapons, Osuna murdered Romero and engaged in some of the most disgusting mutilations imaginable. Romero was decapitated, had various body parts removed, and a smile carved into his face. If that wasn't disturbing enough, Osuna scrawled "ha ha ha" on the cell wall using Romero's blood and crafted a necklace from the severed remains. But what's scarier? A fellow inmate that might murder you because they're edgy and evil like Jamie Osuna, or one that might kill you for no good reason at all because they're completely out of touch with reality. Number 10. Michael Harkin. Dan Childs would probably say the latter if he hadn't been murdered in HMP Bristol by his mentally unstable cellmate, Michael Harkin, in summer of 2024. Not only was Childs' murder sadistic, it was also for the most bizarre reason ever. It was because his surname had the word child in it. Harkin got it into his head that his cellmate was a pedophile, something that was completely untrue, but that didn't stop Harkin from planning to punish him accordingly. Childs was tormented over a long period by Harkin, who told him that if he slept, he would suffocate him. This turned out to be more than an idle threat. On June 4th, while Child slept, Harkin wrapped a TV cord around his neck and strangled him before gently tucking him into bed. But Harkin wasn't done. With one cellmate murdered, he decided to find his former cellmate and then go for a kill streak. Harkin crept up behind his former cellmate in the showers and launched a frenzied attack, slashing wildly with an improvised weapon and intent on murder. The only reason his assassination attempt failed was the quick action of another prisoner who heard the victim's screams and intervened. Armed with a long-handled mop, the prisoner managed to fend Harkin off until the guards arrived. After being convicted of manslaughter, Harkin was transferred out of the jail and into a new permanent position at the high-security Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. Broadmoor, incidentally, is also briefly the stomping ground of our next deadly inmate, who in his prime probably would have eaten anyone else on the list so far for breakfast. Number 9. Robert Maudsley. Robert Maudsley is a self-proclaimed vigilante and hunter of creeps. After murdering a man who propositioned him for sex in 1974, Maudsley was sent to Broadmoor after he was deemed psychologically ill. But this wasn't the end of him. In fact, he was just getting started on his incarcerated killing spree. In 1977, he and a fellow inmate locked themselves in a room with 26-year-old David Francis, a convicted abuser of children. They tortured David to death over the course of 9 solid hours, causing him unimaginable pain before killing him. This got a manslaughter charge appended to Maudsley's ever-growing rap sheet. He was transferred from Broadmoor to Wakefield Prison, which Maudsley took issue with and requested a transfer back. Perhaps they should have listened to him. He'd commit another 2 brutal murders on the same day at Wakefield, making him officially the most prolific killer on this list so far. It was July 29, 1978, when Maudsley decided he wanted to try to kill 7 prisoners in a single day. First was the wife killer, Salney Darwood, who Maudsley garroted and then stabbed to death before hiding his corpse under his bed. After that, Maudsley tried to lure other prisoners into his cell so he could commit a second murder there, but given that Maudsley was not only a known killer, but also very creepy, it didn't work. Instead, with an improvised dagger in hand, he went on the prowl looking for a new victim to kill. He found 56-year-old sex offender William Roberts lying in bed and decided to violently stab him to death and slam his head up against the wall. Once he was done, Maudsley casually walked into the office of the prison wing, drenched in blood, and placed his dagger down on the desk, then said that there would be 2 fewer people at roll call that day. Since then, he's been kept in solitary confinement in a cell designed especially for him. But having your own specially designed cell is one thing. What happens when you're such a dangerous inmate that your exploits inspire the creation of its own supermax prison? Number 8. Tommy Silverstein. Tommy Silverstein, also known as Terrible Tom, was the former leader of the Aryan Brotherhood white supremacist prison gang. Tommy found himself institutionalized in brutal reform schools from a young age. His cruel and domineering mother taught him that the only way to avoid being a victim is to hit back harder and with far more brutality. Tommy took this message to heart and became a violent thug for the rest of his life. That was until a string of armed robberies landed him with a 15-year sentence in Leavenworth, Kansas, and that's where he developed his ties with the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most ruthless prison gangs in the U.S. The first of his several prison murders was Danny Atwell, who refused to act as a heroin mule, so Silverstein killed him. Tommy then got transferred to the United States Penitentiary Marion in Illinois, where he was kept in the control unit for dangerous prisoners. In this prison, he'd later strike up a friendship with fellow neo-Nazi creep Clayton Fontaine and face off against a black prison gang called the DC Blacks. As a part of this ongoing prison race war, Tommy and Clayton murdered rival gang member Robert Chappelle, and later the DC Blacks' national leader Raymond Lee Cadillac Smith. Smith had it out for Tommy, but Tommy was still his mother's son. He and Clayton murdered Smith by stabbing him a horrific 67 times before hanging his body from an elevated prison walkway to show off to the other inmates. Tommy was certainly sending a strong message. He was one of the scariest men in the U.S. prison system. In 1983, Officer Merle Klutz found himself on the receiving end of Tommy's wrath after allegedly destroying some of his paintings. Tommy made an elaborate plan which involved the collaboration of other prisoners involving a shiv and a homemade handcuff key. After breaking from his restraints, Tommy brutally murdered Officer Klutz, and not long after, Tommy's buddy Clayton used this exact same technique to murder another prison officer, Robert Hoffman. In response, he was sentenced to decades in solitary confinement, later becoming the longest-held prisoner in solitary confinement in American history. His murder of Officer Klutz would also serve as the inspiration for the creation of USP Florence AdMax, a hardcore supermax prison in Colorado, created specifically to prevent incidents like this from ever happening again. And that's the legacy of Tommy Silverstein. How about we introduce a little gender equality into the mix? After all, it's not just the men who can be terrifying, dangerous inmates. Number 7. Rebecca Butterfield. Despite Rebecca Butterfield's whimsical name, she is a dangerous and unstable sadist eager to enact violence on whoever she can, even her best friend. While detained at the high-security Silverwater Women's Correctional Center in Australia, she racked up an astonishing 110 disciplinary violations. Among them were 40 assaults on others and just as many self-inflicted incidents, including a horrifying episode where she bashed her head against a wall 105 times, splitting her skull open. She was also known to regularly attack guards and doctors in sudden fits of rage. Her methods included stabbing, biting, and throwing objects at them, including colostomy bags, boiling water, and even her own urine. But in her most brutal incident of all, she turned against her only friend, Blue Slim Ward, for seemingly no reason, stabbing her to death. Rebecca also promised that if she was ever released from prison, she would definitely kill again. Not that being in prison was really stopping her. So far, we've mainly dealt with gangsters and psychopaths killing people in jail to get revenge, gratification, or respect. But what about the escape artists? The inmates who will stop at nothing to taste freedom again, even if it means slaughtering anyone in their way. This was the case for another classic tattooed scoundrel, Ricky DuBose. Number 6. Ricky DuBose. Ricky's most famous act of violence didn't actually take place in the prison itself, but on a bus transporting him and around 30 other prisoners. He and an accomplice, Donnie Rowe, slipped out of their handcuffs and barged their way into the bus's cab. They shot the guard and the driver, Sergeant Christopher Monica and Sergeant Curtis Bilyeu, with their own stolen guns. They managed to escape after this, before being recaptured, at which point Ricky was convicted and given the death penalty, though he was found dead in his cell 10 days later. Our next inmate might not be somebody you've heard of, but you definitely know one of his victims. Number 5. Christopher Scarver. When Christopher Scarver first entered prison, he was known as a man who killed during a botched robbery in June 1990. Suffering from messianic delusions, he sometimes referred to himself as Christ. But Scarver's place in the annals of crime history wasn't secured by that crime alone. It was his fateful encounter with one of the world's most notorious killers, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal. Many of his fellow inmates have said that Dahmer was an unpleasant man to be around in jail. Not surprising, given he was a sadistic, serial-killing necrophiliac. He regularly creeped out the other prisoners by making references to his crimes, and given that the majority of Dahmer's victims had been people of color, this hit a little too close to home for Christopher Scarver, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. While Dahmer and convicted wife killer Jesse Anderson were cleaning the prison gym, Scarver grabbed the metal rod from a barbell and bludgeoned Dahmer in the head with it. Scarver then beat Jesse Anderson to near death with a wooden stick. After doing this, he went to the prison authorities and said, "God told me to do it. Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead." We think that Christopher Scarver probably would have gotten on well with Robert Maudsley if they ever met. Now let's go back to another female convict who just can't seem to keep out of trouble, this time from the Great White North, Canada. Number 4. Renee Jeanette Akobe. The deadly inmate in question is Renee Jeanette Akobe. She's the first woman in Canada to be given the label of dangerous offender, entailing both a permanent stay in prison and special security considerations. So what did Akobe do to earn such a menacing title? Back in 2001, Akobe was being held in an Aboriginal healing lodge when she and a fellow inmate attacked a guard. Akobe's co-conspirator coshed the guard over the head with a sock filled with pieces of metal, and Akobe then held a knife to her throat, threatening to murder her. Thankfully, the guard survived, but Akobe was just getting started with her one-woman war against the Canadian correctional system. In 2002, she took it up a notch and slashed a guard's face with what was very likely a razor blade. The guard survived but was left with some pretty nasty wounds. That same year, Akobe and another friend tied up an inmate and tortured her with broken glass to the legs. This resulted in a hostage situation that lasted 4 hours before the captured inmate narrowly escaped with her life. Things didn't calm down for Akobe in 2003. Teaming up with another accomplice, she launched a brutal attack on an inmate with learning disabilities. Armed with a wooden handle and a metal bar, Akobe beat the woman mercilessly, leaving her with severe injuries across her body. Remarkably, the victim survived, but just barely. In 2004, she held another inmate hostage using a homemade shiv made out of a toothbrush and a razor blade, which she held up to the fellow inmate's throat. And in 2005, another accomplice helped Akobe take a pair of guards hostage, torturing them over a number of hours. They were forced to take medications, had their bodies cut, and had cigarettes put out on their skin. One of the guards got a particularly rough ride, getting chunks of her hair pulled out, having air freshener sprayed into her eyes, and getting repeatedly punched in the face. In 2007, when Akobe was being escorted to the prison showers by 3 armed guards, she turned the tables and created yet another hostage situation. She pulled out a sharp screw she'd taken from a CD player and held it to one of the guards' throats, threatening to pierce a vital artery if her demands weren't met. She then wrapped a belt around the guard's neck and demanded, among other things, a transfer to a different institution, cigarettes, and a soda. Now for a bit of a monster-on-monster crime from New England. Number 3. Mark Hobson. You may not be familiar with the spree killer Mark Hobson, but the more you find out about him, the more you're likely to hate him. Back in 2002, he got into a spat with a love rival and stabbed him 5 times in the chest, puncturing his lung. Hobson's victims survived this incident, but his next ones wouldn't be so lucky. During a vicious 2004 killing spree, he murdered 4 people in North Yorkshire. The first was his girlfriend, Claire Sanderson, who he beat almost to death with a hammer and then strangled her. The second, Claire's sister, Diane. He tied her up and brutally tortured her before murdering her in a similar fashion. Not long after this, he killed an elderly couple, James and Joan Britton, together. Because of the horrific nature of his crimes, he was sentenced to life in prison with the rare recommendation from a judge that he would never be released. While in jail, he had an altercation with a fellow prisoner named Ian Huntley, who had been convicted of drowning 2 young girls in a bathtub. Hobson attacked Huntley and poured boiling water all over him, which led to Hobson being put into solitary confinement. Our next inmate was, for a time, considered to be in the top 10 most dangerous prisoners in the world. He earned that terrifying title, and you're about to find out why. Number 2. James Porky O'Rourke. James Porky O'Rourke has been in prison for over 30 years now, since murdering a man named Neil Kearney back in 1992. Witnesses saw him dropping a large slab of concrete on Neil's head, and in prison, Porky only got more violent. In 1997, he was handed an additional 6 years in prison after taking a prison officer and a nurse hostage for 19 straight hours, threatening their lives throughout. In 2002, he assaulted and abducted another victim in jail, giving him another 8 years in jail. And then in 2004, he gave another attack that scored him 4 more years in the clink. In 2005, Porky made a name for himself at HMP Kilmarnock, where he stabbed a prison escort and a senior jail official with a smuggled blade. That got another 8 years added to his sentence, and in 2019 he got another 9 years for slitting another prisoner's throat in the jail gym. And Porky's prison crime spree was still not over. In 2022, he was given another life sentence after murdering fellow inmate Dean Ramsey. Ramsey was tied up and beaten severely before Porky made a garrote out of bed sheets, wrapped it around the man's throat, and methodically strangled him to death. A source inside the prison said, "It doesn't take much for Porky to flip." That much is actually pretty obvious by now. But no list of the world's most dangerous prison inmates would be complete without one very special and exceedingly violent man. His exploits were so famous that he was even portrayed by Tom Hardy in a 2008 movie based on his life and crimes. Number 1. Charles Bronson. We are talking, of course, about Michael Gordon Peterson, better known by his professional name Charles Bronson. From humble beginnings with a family involved in local politics in his hometown of Luton, Charles's life took a very different path. At just 13, he joined a violent gang, marking the start of his criminal career and leading to his first stint in juvenile detention. As the years went on, he became a more and more violent man, getting into fights with his friends, strangers, and managers at the various jobs he had trouble holding down. In 1974, at the age of 22, Bronson officially started his career as a professional prisoner when he was sent to Walton Jail for robbery. Within a few days, he attacked a pair of other prisoners and got sent to the high-security area known as the punishment block. This would not prove to be an effective deterrent. In 1975, he was transferred to HMP Hale, where he started having altercations with the guards, and smashed up the prison workshop. He was taken to the punishment block there and injected with a mood stabilizer that made him sick until he was deemed safe to re-enter the general population. But that didn't work, and he immediately started attacking his fellow inmates again. In the years that followed, he was transferred from prison to prison, leaving a trail of carnage in his wake. He beat up prisoners and guards, destroyed property, and made frequent escape attempts, in one case trying to dig his way out of prison. But he still wasn't done. In 1985, when he was stationed in the infamous Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, he escaped and performed a rooftop protest, causing $250,000 of property damage in the process. He also took hostages almost constantly at various prisons, with his victims being everyone from his art teacher to a pair of Iraqi hijackers in 1996. It reached a point where his jailers realized that he simply was not safe around any other people. That's why in 1999 he had a special unit built just for him to keep him away from the general prison population for good. These days he's mellowed out and mainly focuses on his painting, a passion so dear to him that since 2014 he's mainly gone by Charles Salvador, as a tribute to the surrealist painter Salvador Dali. His last appeal for parole was rejected in 2023, so it is unlikely that the infamous Charles Bronson will stop being England's most dangerous prisoner anytime soon. Which of these dangerous prisoners shocked you the most? Do you agree they're the worst? Or is someone else more terrifying? Share your thoughts in the comments. Eyes down, you focus on the chipped, bloody floor as you wait for your first taste of prisoner chow. Scenes from every prison movie flash in your head. Sit by the wrong guy, and lunch might be served with a side of shattered teeth. You throw a friendly, let's be real, borderline creepy smile at the server, the portion god himself. Today's menu: slow braised short rib, Parmesan mashed potatoes, truffle mac and cheese. Don't believe us? Keep watching. This is the Infographic Show. What prison food is really like. Alright, we lied to you. Prison food is more like tubes of mystery meat on a bed of radioactive mashed potato, accompanied by a dollop of super adhesive mac and cheese. The veg, a handful of traumatized green beans that look like they've been to war. 800 years from now, archaeologists will study it and wonder if this was our version of cruel and unusual punishment. There is a good reason why 90% of prisoners try to avoid prison food. It sucks with a capital S. And you'll soon find out why. Just one look at an average meal in an American prison is enough to make you pledge allegiance to Nancy Reagan's ghost, vowing to never jaywalk again. It's a symphony of bland beige that resembles dog puke, a sad plate of nope. As any dietitian will tell you, this isn't usually a good sign. Colors matter. The food, can we call it that, is supposed to follow what the Department of Corrections calls dietary guidelines for Americans. It's also supposed to embrace nutrient diversity, although supposed to and does are very different things. If color is anything to go by, it's about as diverse as an amoeba. Not long ago, Dakota County Jail served bologna, bread, and water every night, 365 days a year. This was served up 14 hours after the only other meal, breakfast. Prisoners still got 2,700 calories a day in the form of a never-ending bologna nightmare. U.S. prisoners are mentally scarred by it. Grown men weep at the sight of processed slices of meat. But what does the Bureau of Prisons mean by dietary guidelines for Americans? As all of our viewers know, the U.S. is a bastion of nutritious cuisine, celebrated worldwide for its culinary health excellence. At an average of 3,600 calories a day, Americans consume well over their required daily intake, much of it made up of future leg-amputating added sugars. But prison inmates are not so lucky. The DOC claims to provide its male prisoners with 2,600 to 2,800 calories daily, while women should be getting around 2,000 calories a day. But as any prisoner will tell you, it's more than likely you'll spend most of your prison days feeling hungry. The truth is, in a lot of U.S. prisons, you might only get 1,800 calories a day. And that's not so much when you spend most of your day trying to stay in shape to fend off the next guy ready to stab you over a missing crayon. We looked at a typical breakfast in an Oklahoma prison, which was so lacking in color that it almost had stealth capabilities. It featured a slice of white bread, 2 boiled eggs, some powdered scrambled eggs, and the worst part, a mound of congealed cereal that looks suspiciously like the contents of a formula-fed baby diaper. Still, in U.S. prisons, you're supposed to get 6 servings of fruits and veggies per day, whole grains twice a day, and 28 grams of protein at a minimum. There will be regular servings of milk and sweetened juice. The problem is it's also so incredibly bland and practically inedible. In New York State, almost 92% of prisoners in a survey said the food was tasteless. Nearly 96% said that they preferred to make their own meals with food from the commissary, but that causes its own problems. The healthy stuff in the commissary costs more than the unhealthy stuff, so unless you have a hustle-running spice, the non-food version, you might struggle to get the nutrients you need. Now, some of you might be thinking, do the crime, do the time. No one ever said prison was gonna be easy. Okay, but is it fair to serve prisoners something only marginally better than the food you'd serve your pet Cocker Spaniel? Let us know in the comments. The sheer lack and vile quality of U.S. prison food has sparked riots and made prison guards enemy number one. In a human rights-based study, good food was said to improve not just prisoner health, but also cut back on the levels of violence and recidivism. The U.S. has some of the highest reoffending rates in the world. Almost 70% of prisoners are arrested again within 3 years of release. Okay, we can't just blame the food, but it probably doesn't help. 9 out of 10 prisoners in the U.S.'s 1.5 million prison population said that they didn't get enough food. A disturbing 3 out of 4 said they'd been served spoiled or rotten food. So they either don't get enough or they can't eat it because it smells like decomposing hamburger meat scraped from corpse teeth. Prisoners often report losing weight fast. An investigation at the Montgomery County Jail in New York said that one male prisoner lost 90 pounds in less than 6 months while existing on the standard prison diet. Another prisoner in a different prison said he ate everything he was served each day and lost 25 pounds in 4 months. He explained, "I couldn't wait to go home, restart my life, and eat a diet that didn't kill me." At Georgia's Gordon County Jail, investigations showed prisoners were getting over 2,800 calories a day. Even so, they got breakfast and dinner, but no lunch. The wait was so long that some of the inmates said they started licking syrup packets. As for the biscuit and gravy for breakfast, we would not be exaggerating if we said we could put that gravy in a video about the world's worst tortures. The cup of creamed wheat at the Bow County Jail in Montana was another dish that aesthetically falls within the descriptive parameters of hot vomit. The average American spends around $8 a day on food, but if you land in prison in Florida, your daily allowance will be about $2.32. In California, it's $2.45 a day. These are two of the most packed prison states in the country, with 199,000 and 157,000. Only Texas has more, with 219,000 inmates, and there the daily food budget is even lower, at $2.22. To put that into perspective, that is less than half the cost of a box of fresh-cut watermelon at Target. And in prison, they're making 3 meals out of it. One of our writers at the infographic show once spent a summer working at a massive plant that produced prison food. Let's just say this food wasn't exactly made with love and care. According to him, the workers at the plant had about as much experience making food as they did designing spaceships. These plants buy in bulk, going for the cheapest foodstuffs they can find. Our staff member described how ingredients were piled onto conveyor belts from giant plastic tubs, handled by workers who were often untrained and poorly paid. His job was to monitor food temperatures at each stage, trying to prevent bacterial spread, a tough task given the scale of operations. In a 2017 study, it was found that there were 200 foodborne disease outbreaks in American prisons, resulting in over 20,600 illnesses, 204 hospitalizations, and 5 people dying. As any inmate who worked in the kitchen will tell you, food arrives in prison in huge bags and containers. When it's Taco Tuesday, the ready-made sauce is poured into large vats. From start to finish, it's an industrial process. It's almost impossible to make this much food taste good. It is basically slop, more suitable to pigs than humans. Back in the 2000s, under the infamous human rights breaching Sheriff Joe Arpaio, in Arizona's Maricopa County, meal costs dropped to as low as 15 to 40 cents each. Any cheaper and it would disappear. One former prison resident, the British ecstasy kingpin turned YouTuber Sean Atwood, said one of the meals was nicknamed Red Death. It was a slop made with mystery ingredients, including the occasional extra protein from a dead rat. He actually said that. Now let's look at what's on offer in the prison commissary. Here, prisoners might get a maximum spending budget of $350 a month, although in some prisons it might be as little as $35 a week. In line with the USA's famed diagonal-shaped rates of diabetes, a lot of products in the commissary are the ultra-processed kind. A 2024 study said The prevalence of diabetes among non-incarcerated individuals is high, but the prevalence is considerably worse in our prisons and jails. It's not just diabetes. According to the Department of Justice, 44% of people serving time in state or federal prisons report ever having a chronic illness. That's compared to 31% of the general population. In short, prison food makes you sick. For $3.50 at the commissary, you can treat yourself to a tube of jalapeno squeeze cheese, packed with nutritional goodies like sorbic acid and xanthan gum. If you're feeling fancy, Nutella hazelnut spread is available for $4.90. On the healthier side, there is stuffed chicken with rice for $5.75. Prisoners say they long for the days when food looked like food. Anything served on the bone is highly prized. It is one of the rare times inmates will set aside their commissary snacks. Still, mystery meat reigns as the prison staple. When food glows, you know there's an issue. One prisoner described a meat dish he used to get that was gray in color with a slightly iridescent sheen to it. In Michigan, another prisoner described the meatballs as fluorescent. At least they helped brighten up the cell, we suppose. The question on every prisoner's mind is, what is this stuff? Chicken? Pork? Beef? It all tastes similar and usually looks the same. A former prisoner who worked in the kitchen explained, there was this box of meat that said turkey parts on it. The shape of the meat is not like any part of turkey I've ever seen. Another former prisoner said, imagine eating bologna that smells like fish for 18 years. This is the cheapest mystery meat America has to offer. Think offal, bits of organs, or whatever can be scraped off a carcass via mechanical separation. Sure, gas station hot dogs might come close, but let's not forget prison meat is part of a daily meal plan costing less than $3. There's also the bonus of the food making you sick. You not only get the cheapest cuts in prison, but you also usually get the most lax health and safety standards. In 2014, 30 prisoners in Michigan came down with food poisoning when it was discovered maggots and fly larvae were crawling around next to the food trays. It's just as bad for the women as it is for the men in prison in terms of food. A female kitchen worker at an unnamed prison recently shared a very short story in the horror genre of nonfiction. The hot dog was very dark and the beans had what appeared to be bugs on it. Closer inspection revealed a ton of unhatched maggots. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that U.S. prison inmates are 6.4 times more likely to suffer from a food-related illness than Americans on the outside. Outbreaks are common. Recently, Mississippi prisons dropped a food provider after serving meals described as spoiled, rotten, moldy, or uncooked. Photos of the meals looked like a dog on death's door vomit, from bright yellow slop to a sauce that might be named essence of diarrhea. Unsurprisingly, kitchen staff also spotted food marked not for human consumption. It's the reason why some prisoners pretend they're Jewish or Muslim when they've never been within 100 feet of a synagogue or a mosque. By faking it, they might get kosher or halal food. As for vegetarians and vegans, that doesn't fall under religion, so you won't be getting special treatment. You'll just have to trade food items with other prisoners or hope you have enough cash to live on commissary goods. Even then, your choices are severely limited. Still, if you're lucky enough to be dying or are very sick, a prison physician might put you on a special meal plan. There's no guarantee this will be safe from maggots or rat poop, but the food might be low in sugars and fats. One inmate said at his prison one of the most popular commissary foods was noodles. Cheese curls, chips, and Jolly Ranchers came next. Number one by far, he said, were Little Debbie cakes. To put it another way, if you plan to live on commissary food for years on end, there's a good chance you'll be rolling out of prison in a wheelchair. A recent investigation revealed that commissary food might be 5 times more expensive than the same goods on the outside. The study said the prices reveal an exploitative, inconsistent system, which marks up goods as much as 600%. A 35-cent pack of ramen at Target becomes a 40-cent plus packet in prison. Noodles were 57 cents in Missouri prisons, and that same brand was $1.06 in Florida prisons. It all depends on which blood-sucking, price-gouging company is supplying the prison. Going to prison is like playing Indignity Dominoes. It's just one poop sandwich after another, sometimes literally if you count the rat feces. What do you think? Do prisoners deserve better chow, or is mystery meat and maggots enough? Where would you put the most dangerous prisoner in all of America? What lengths would you go to keep him locked down? Barbed wire, steel doors, motion sensors, guard dogs, sharpshooters? In his cell, how many liberties and basic necessities could you strip away and whittle down while still keeping him alive. At what point did you cross the line from detention to torture? We've all seen Alcatraz, a huge looming block of cells isolated on an island. The waters are icy, the currents are vicious. Even if you could somehow break out of your cell and off the island, you'd drown or be thrown against the rocks before you made it halfway to the mainland. What if we told you that there's a prison that's even more severe, a facility that's infamous for its utter inescapability, where prisoners will spend decades of their lives in the same 2 concrete rooms, never breathing fresh air, never feeling sunlight on their faces, a place where you'd send the man so dangerous that human contact is strictly off limits at all times. Welcome to Florence AdMax. Nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies, this supermax prison was built near Florence, Colorado, to be for the worst of the worst. Go anywhere near the 37-acre site, and you'll see watchtowers dotting the landscape. In those towers, you won't find just lookouts. You'll see sunlight glinting off the scopes of sniper rifles. Beneath the ground at your feet are hidden pressure pads. Sweeping the area are an undisclosed number of laser beams, detecting any kind of motion. A team of highly trained guard dogs patrol the grounds constantly, ready to chase down any escapees at the drop of a hat. But before we can even use the word escape seriously, you need to consider what's on the other side of the 12-foot-high razor wire fences encircling the whole facility. Floodlights illuminate the entire place day and night. Motion detectors watch most of the ground, but anywhere they can't see, you can bet will be covered by the extensive network of security cameras, each one remote-controlled. There are no external windows to bust out of, at least none larger than a few inches and equally as thick. Your best bet would be to get out one of the doors. Should be doable. There are only 1,400 of them, each one reinforced steel. The concept of breaking out of Florence AdMax is about as close to an impossibility as it can get. You would need nothing short of US military to get in or out of that place if they didn't want you to. Looking at it from above, we can see the different blocks. There are general population units Delta, Echo, Fox, and Golf, where most of the prison's approximately 350 inmates are housed. Then there's the Special Housing Unit, SHU, used for solitary confinement, where inmates may be moved temporarily as punishment for bad behavior. But wait, it gets worse, much worse. Beyond the SHU is the Control Unit, where gang leaders are housed, cutting them off from their followers, as well as the kind of prisoners who tend to incite violence in the larger units. Here you'll find some of the most notorious gang leaders Chicago and New York have ever seen. James Little Jimmy Marcello, who has a decades-long rap sheet of extortion, loan sharking, and murder, is neighbors with Omar O.G. Mac Porty, who founded the Nine Trey Gangsters and the unique Blood Nation while in Rikers. But they're nothing compared to the main man on the block, Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Loera. You probably know him by his other name, El Chapo. Under his rule, the cartel raked in at least $3 billion per year in revenue. Experts have estimated that around 25% of all illegal drugs that entered the U.S. via Mexico come through El Chapo's ring. He was such a danger that the city of Chicago branded him as public enemy number 1, the first of that title since Al Capone. That's gotta be the worst of the worst right there. You can't get much higher security than El Chapo, right? Wrong. Beyond the Control Unit is the Special Security Unit, or H Unit. It's here that America sends some of its most dangerous terrorists, people who have special rules and regulations made just for them due to the nature of their crimes. In those cells, you'll find some of the most infamous murderers, terrorists, and serial killers in U.S. history. The Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski, was here all the way up to 2021, past his cell, serving 3 life terms plus 110 years in prison without parole, is the Shoe Bomber, Richard Reed, who tried to take down a transatlantic flight in 2001 with an explosive in his shoe. Former FBI agent turned Soviet spy Robert Philip Hansen is serving 15 consecutive life sentences just around the corner. Seeing the conditions in Guantanamo Bay, it's apparent just how detested terrorists are in the United States prison system. But that's a video for another day. Unit H must be the final stage in the Supermax prison, the most secure wing for the most dangerous prisoners. But no, there's one more. Prison officers describe the place as a cleaner version of hell. The smallest unit in the whole complex, it has just 4 cells. This is Range 13. In all of the prison's 30-year history, we only publicly know of 3 men who have been held here. And it is here we'll find a prisoner so dangerous that this entire facility was designed because of his actions. The prisoner who holds the record for the second longest time spent in solitary confinement in U.S. prison history, beaten only by Albert Woodfox, who was kept in solitary for 43 years. It's the former leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, Thomas Edward Silverstein. We'll give you a tour of his cell soon enough, but first we should dive into what one man can possibly do that's so heinous that he's barred from any and all human contact for the rest of his life, multiple times over. Terrible Tom Silverstein was born February 4, 1952, in Long Beach, California. Even before he was born, his life was in turmoil. His mother, Virginia, was having an affair with a man named Thomas Conway. As an adult, Tommy claimed that Thomas Conway was his biological father, which is likely part of what led Virginia to divorce her husband and remarry Conway before little Tommy was even born. Born Thomas Conway, named after his mother's brand new husband, the little boy didn't have long to get used to his family life before it was upended again. The marriage broke down, and by Tommy's 4th birthday, he had another father, a man named Sid Silverstein. Silverstein adopted the boy as his own and passed on his surname, but it was clear from a young age that Tommy Silverstein was not going to live an easy life. Virginia was a drinker. The more she drank, the more violent she'd become, something Thomas would become more familiar with. One of Silverstein's earliest memories was a time when he had wet the bed. His mother flew into a rage and grabbed a paper cup from the kitchen. She demanded that he pee into the cup and then drink it. She warned him that this was going to happen every time he wet the bed from that point on. Silverstein was incredibly timid growing up, always shying away from other kids and not wanting to engage at school. The other kids, having heard the Jewish surname Silverstein and seeing him as a weak target, started to pick on him. This anti-Semitic bullying started from a young age. Tommy returned home from school one day with a bloody nose, which was the work of an older boy named Gary. The next day, Virginia waited outside the school for Gary to leave. When she saw him, she grabbed the boy and held him still, demanding that Tommy punch him in the face as hard as he could. Tommy did what he was told. The next day, Gary's father tried to return the favor, snatching Tommy on his way home, but the boy escaped and ran home. That night, in a drunken rage, Virginia took Tommy to Gary's family's home and threw bricks through the windows. The lesson she was doing her best to drill into him was that violence was always the solution, and any kind of vulnerability was weakness, and she would not have a weak son. It was Tommy's job to do the worst jobs in the house. Virginia had a chihuahua who would defecate everywhere, so she decided it was her son's job to clean it up for her. One day, as he was doing the job, the dog bit him on the hand. This time, it was Tommy's turn to fly into a rage. He hauled the dog outside and hung it from the tree by its leash, lynching the animal to within an inch of its life. Realizing the horror of what he was doing, Tommy let it go and cradled the dog in his arms as it panted feebly on the edge of death. At that moment, looking down at the dog, Tommy saw himself, but something else clicked too. As much as he felt like a monster for what he had done, he just couldn't help but savor the sweet taste of revenge. That dog was smaller than him. For the first time in his life, he was bigger and tougher. Sure enough, once Tommy got into high school, the table started to turn. He hit a growth spurt and soon towered over his mom. Just before his 15th birthday, Tommy snuck out of the bedroom in the middle of the night. He knew where Sid kept the shotgun, and he tiptoed over to the weapon, peering at it in the light from the street lamps coming through the window. Reaching out a trembling hand, Tommy took the gun. Surprised by how heavy it was, quietly as he could, he crept into his mom's room, where she and Sid were lying fast asleep. Tommy took a deep breath and walked over to her side of the bed. Looking down at her from his new height, he felt hatred filling his entire being. Gently as he could, he raised the shotgun and laid the barrel perfectly under her chin. His hands were trembling, but his mind was surprisingly steady. He pulled the trigger. Click. The gun was empty. Tommy let out a shaky breath, took the gun away from his mother's head, and put it back where he found it. The next day at breakfast, he didn't talk about what had happened, but he sat there, feeling a strange sense of peace. He could do it. He knew that now. He had what it took to kill her if he wanted to. From that moment on, he fought back. He wouldn't put up with his mother's aggression any longer. He'd fight with Sid whenever the man would try to discipline him. Despite having the man's surname, Tommy had never seen Sid as his real father. He'd always remained attached to Thomas Conway, who for much of his life had been in and out of prison. Everybody was poor, but Thomas Conway always had schemes to try to change that. At age 19, Tommy Silverstein got roped into a chain of events that would change his life forever. Thomas Conway was in the robbery game. Armed robbery, to be specific. He liked to have a crew with him to hit target spots hard and get out quickly. Looking for new recruits, he brought along Tommy as a new recruit. But the robbery went wrong. They got caught, and Tommy was locked up in San Quentin Prison in California. 4 years later, Tommy got paroled, but rather than try to turn his life around, he committed to the job, going out for another string of robberies with his father. This time, when they got caught, the sentence was much more severe. Now 23 and a repeat offender for armed robbery, Tommy was given a much harsher sentence of 15 years. A young man now, he wouldn't be out of prison until he was nearly 40. When he was to get out, what could he even do? Who could he be? Starting your life at 38 with little education, a criminal record, childhood trauma, and the life experience of a 23-year-old is a bleak future indeed. For all intents and purposes, Tommy's life became a prison. The four walls around him became the limits of his existence, and like an animal raised in a zoo, he adjusted to his environment. Tommy was sent to prison in Leavenworth, Kansas, with a fierce racial gang culture inside. Tommy found acceptance in the Aryan Brotherhood. No longer was he being picked on for kids thinking he was Jewish. Now he was the bully. This was in the late 70s and early 80s, so heroin usage was rampant in the prison system. Tommy was involved in trafficking it around, a job he found he was pretty good at. It wasn't Tommy's first experience like this. When he was 14, Tommy had been sent off to the California Youth Authority Reformatory, a facility designed to reform young teenagers and change them from their ways before it was too late. The reality was almost the total opposite. When talking about the place near the end of his life, Tommy said that all it did was reinforce the lessons he learned as a kid. In his own words, anyone not willing to fight was abused. But one day in Leavenworth, somebody said no to him. Danny Atwell, a fellow prisoner, refused to be a heroin mule for the Aryan Brotherhood. Tommy dealt with the situation the only way he knew how. He stabbed Danny Atwell to death, allegedly. You see, while this conviction was later overturned in 1985, as it came to light that those giving evidence against Silverstein were lying, it was enough to have him transferred to more secure confinement at USP Marion, Illinois, with a life sentence added to his time behind bars. He was placed in the control unit, essentially solitary confinement, when he arrived, as he was deemed to be a highly disruptive and dangerous presence. At Marion, he had a ceiling light in his cell that would be on permanently so that the security cameras pointed at him wouldn't miss a thing. He struggled to sleep and reported that the prison guards were antagonistic and cruel to him. In 1981, Silverstein was on trial again. This time it was for killing Robert Chappelle, a member of the DC Blacks gang. Much like his first trial, this was based on witness statements, which Silverstein had strenuously denied for all of his life. This murder had caused a real stir throughout the prison, which was only made worse when one of the leaders of the DC Blacks gang was transferred from another prison entirely and put just a couple of doors down from Silverstein. With the trial still dragging on, Raymond Lee Cadillac Smith arrived at USP Marion and immediately made threats that he was going to kill Tommy Silverstein the first chance he got. Silverstein protested his innocence, but it fell on deaf ears. The guards in the prison did little to keep the two men apart. Silverstein even believed that they were deliberately putting the men together all the time in the hopes they would kill each other. And sure enough, it happened. Silverstein, along with his friend Clayton Fountain, stabbed Cadillac 67 times. They then paraded his body up and down the walkways outside of the cells, showing everybody in prison exactly what they had done and why they weren't to be messed with. You're either the bully or the victim. Silverstein had made up his mind about which he'd be. Another life sentence was added to his time, confirming that Tommy Silverstein would never be a free man again. So he got used to life inside. One hobby he took up was painting, but little did he know that this was to be the start of the worst years of his life. United States prisons have a rule that any artwork created by prisoners that depicts murder is to be confiscated and destroyed. Tommy had a number of his paintings taken away from him, for what we may never know. The officer responsible was Merle Klutz. Not only did Tommy hate the man for taking his artwork away, but he alleged the man had been harassing him and bullying him without anyone stepping in to do anything about it. So he decided to do something about it. Walking behind Klutz one day, Tommy had another prisoner sneak him a homemade key to his cuffs and a shank. He leaped at Klutz and stabbed him to death before the other officers could pull him away. Just a few hours later, his friend Clayton Fountain did the exact same thing to another officer. The prison was placed on lockdown immediately. This ran the risk of getting out of control fast. Prison stabbings were common, but when it was between prisoners, it was often seen as an acceptable casualty. That was just the natural order. But when the prisoners started stabbing guards, that could start a riot that would threaten the security of the entire facility. If prisoners suddenly started seeing their guards as vulnerable, able to be killed, what's to stop them from doing that at every opportunity? The prison system needed to send a message to make an example of Tommy Silverstein. USP Marion's lockdown was indefinite, lasting for 23 years in total. Silverstein was sent to Atlanta, where he was placed in solitary, with strict instructions that he was to have zero human contact. But in the background, larger pieces were starting to fall in place. The BOP began working in earnest on a new project, a new supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. That was to be the ultimate deterrent. Silverstein was in his cell 23 hours a day on his own for close to 4 years, until all of a sudden his door was opened. It was 1987. Cuban detainees had rioted and taken control of the prison, what became known as the Atlanta prison riots. The Cubans unlocked Silverstein's cell and allowed him to walk freely through the facility, where he eventually found the guards who were being held as hostages. Silverstein knelt down in front of one of them and began to talk. Aware of Silverstein's history, the Cubans were growing nervous. Those hostages were negotiating power. If the guards were to be killed, they'd have nothing protecting them from the military storming the facility and putting the riot to a painful end. Fortunately for them, the guard Silverstein was talking to was his favorite. The man had always made a point of asking Silverstein if his handcuffs were too tight and loosening them if they were. Wiping the sweat from their brows, the Cubans released Silverstein, sending him to the hostage negotiation team outside before he could do any damage. He was transferred back to Leavenworth for 18 more years until eventually the security status of that prison was downgraded. But fortunately, a new facility was up and running now. It was one of the most secure prisons in all of human history, with a cell made specifically for punishment and deterrence. ADX Florence, specifically a cell in range 13. At this point, Tommy Silverstein already spent 22 years in solitary confinement, but in Florence it was about to get a whole lot worse. Welcome to Tommy Silverstein's cell in range 13. Every inch of this cell has specifically been designed to do the bare minimum possible to sustain human life and to remove any last sliver of connection with the outside world. The cell is just 3.5 meters by 2 meters, or 12 feet by 7 feet. The total floor space with the room's curved wall amounts to 80 square feet. That's the smallest legal limit for a New York City kitchen. The bed is made from concrete. There's a stool at the foot of the bed, also made from concrete. The toilet bowl itself is made as part of the wall, also concrete. There's an open shower in the corner of the room, so close to the bed that any shower will inevitably wet the bedding. The water is on a timer, activated by a push of a button. On the wall at the head of the bed is a window. The window is just 4 inches wide with incredibly thick reinforced glass. In reality, it's more of a slit to allow light through. Tommy Silverstein was to spend 23 hours per day there, receiving food through a slot in the door. The instructions from his previous detention center carried over: zero human contact. For the other hour in the day, he was taken to what's called the empty swimming pool. This room had marginally more space than his cell, but with much less inside. It was just an empty room. The one feature that made it equivalent to having outdoor time was a 4x4-inch skylight in the ceiling. If Tommy behaved, he would be given books to read and eventually a small black and white TV. He could have 2 phone calls per month. Aside from that, he was on his own. But there is a big question that we haven't answered in all of this. Why him? ADX Florence houses prisoners like El Chapo and the Unabomber, gang leaders and terrorists. Tommy Silverstein was locked up for armed robbery and committed up to 3 murders. These are obviously awful crimes, but they pale in comparison to running a drug empire larger than dozens of countries' GDPs. The truth is that Tommy Silverstein was there to send a message. An unnamed prison officer, talking to author Pete Early, explained it bluntly. When an inmate kills a guard, he must be punished. We can't execute Silverstein, so we have no choice but to make his life a living hell. Otherwise, other inmates will kill guards too. There has to be some supreme punishment. Every convict knows what Silverstein is going through. We want them to realize that if they cross the same line that he did, they will pay a heavy price. Silverstein's case is a controversial one. The punishment in comparison to the crimes is extreme. Over the course of his lifetime, Tommy Silverstein spent a total of 36 years in those conditions, eclipsing the sentences of people who have done far worse crimes, had stronger evidence, and shown less remorse. As humans, we tend to argue that everyone's life is equally valid, but it is clear that the who of Silverstein's victim is the reason for his punishment. If he had killed another prisoner, no one would have batted an eyelid. Yet, because it's a guard, he's now infamous and the subject of a number of human rights complaints. The prison system, rightly or wrongly, has taken extreme actions against one individual to make him a symbol for other prisoners of what happens when they step out of line. Much like all of Silverstein's childhood, it comes down once again to who is the biggest and the strongest. You're either the bully or the victim. In this case, the prison system has chosen to be the bully. They have time and again within these facilities where guards exercise their powers unfairly to keep prisoners in line. Tommy Silverstein, by the end of his life, claimed to have been reformed. He talked openly over the phone about how self-reflection, meditation, and Buddhism had shown him the damage he had caused and the errors of his previous life. A foundation was set up by his family to campaign for reform to prevent what was happening to him from happening to others. This begs the question of what prison is for in the first place. Is it to reform convicts, to educate them and show them right from wrong so they can be released as productive members of society? Or is it there to punish them, to serve justice for the crimes that they have committed and act as a deterrent to scare others from doing the same? Is prison for the people inside it at all, or is it for those on the outside, to help the general population feel safe at night and scare the criminals straight at the thought of being caught? Tommy Silverstein had his own views on these questions. Even though we may not execute people by the masses, as they do in other countries, our government leaders bury people alive for life in cement tombs. It's actually more humane to execute someone than it is to torture them year after year after year. It's hard to know the kind of trauma, mental illness, and fury that could drive somebody to commit the kinds of crimes for which these prisoners are responsible. For many of them, their crimes are like flames licking out of the windows of a burning apartment block as the true inferno rages inside. Their actions are the lashings out of a dark mind twisted beyond recognition. Any of us would find it unbearable to be left alone with just our thoughts for more than a few days. Imagine how it would feel to be alone in that concrete box with only that kind of mind for company year after year, decade after decade. Would death be less cruel? At what point does a monster become a victim? And at what point do the men punishing him become themselves monsters? In this video, you'll learn about a killer clown's KFC feast, a strangler's rage at his missing SpaghettiOs, a white supremacist murderer's final act of diabolical food-based spite, and so much more. These are some of the most insane death row last meals. You'll hear about each of these convicts' heinous crimes and the deranged meals they decided to go out with. We'll warn you though, this video will make you horrified and hungry. Let's start off with Oscar Ray Bolin Jr. This former Florida carnival worker was found guilty of first-degree murder and false imprisonment in 1986. Bolin was a serial killer sentenced to life in prison and eventually to death for the killing of Stephanie Ann Collins, age 17, Natalie Hawley, age 25, and Terry Lynn Matthews, who was 26. Bolin Jr.'s crimes were sadistic and gruesome, like something from a primetime detective thriller. Collins and Matthews were both found wrapped in white sheets after having been stabbed or slashed repeatedly and having their skulls crushed. And the scariest part is that he almost got away with it and may have even killed again, were it not for another crime he committed, being a terrible husband. In 1982, before he began his killing spree, he committed a campaign of abuse and terror against Cheryl Hafner, whom he married a year later in 1983. He'd go on to commit his first murder in 1986, committing less lethal assaults against other women afterwards, and killed his other two victims that same year before separating from Cheryl in 1989. Bolin Jr.'s goose was cooked when Cheryl told her next husband about her ex's violent behavior and murderous bragging. When Cheryl's new hubby called the police tip line, these terrible acts of violence were put to an end. In 2016, Oscar Ray Bolin Jr. was put to death for his crimes, a full 3 decades after murdering the young women. He was 53 and executed via lethal injection. For his final meal, Bolin was reported to have ordered a ribeye steak, which he wanted to be cooked medium rare. He also asked for a baked potato with butter and sour cream, a salad that specifically had tomato and cucumber on the top, garlic bread, and a bottle of Coca-Cola as a beverage. For dessert, Bolin asked for a slice of lemon meringue pie. That's pretty sweet, unlike the crimes of our next contestant. A man named Earl Forrest found himself on the receiving end of the death sentence in Missouri for a series of murders he committed on the night of December 9, 2002. Forrest, who had apparently been drinking earlier that night, entered the home of one Harriet Smith, a woman who allegedly had agreed to buy a mobile home and a lawnmower for Forrest after he had introduced her to a source for supplying methamphetamine. During an ensuing altercation, Forrest shot Smith 6 times, killing her as well as a guest of hers named Michael Wells by shooting him in the head. After stealing $25,000 worth of methamphetamine, Forrest returned home, where a shootout with police ensued, resulting in the death of Deputy Joanne Barnes. Forrest also shot both Sheriff Bob Woodford and his own girlfriend, Angela Gamblin. However, both would thankfully survive their injuries. Charged and found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, Earl Forrest would spend 11 years on death row. When the time finally came for his last meal, he chose to eat pasta, steak, tomatoes, cucumbers, a side of fruit, and a slice of chocolate cake, washed down with a glass of milk afterward. Now there's an idea for a Got Milk commercial that would probably never get approved. Next on the menu is one Ronnie Lee Gardner, a man sent to prison in 1980 for robbery, only to escape in 1981. When confronting a man who had been in bed with Gardner's girlfriend, he was wounded by a gunshot and arrested after being returned to prison. But not for long. Gardner would escape once again in 1984 after being taken to the hospital for a checkup, overpowering a guard and taking his pistol. He would kill a man named Melvin Otterstrom, who tended the bar at the Cheers Tavern in Salt Lake City, Utah. A year later, in 1985, Gardner was being transported from Utah State Prison to the courthouse to attend a pre-trial hearing for the second-degree murder of Melvin Otterstrom. It was upon entering the courthouse that an accomplice, Kara Jolly Hainsworth, handed him a revolver she'd smuggled inside in order to help Gardner pull off his latest escape attempt. She'd even hidden a bag containing a change of clothes, duct tape, and a knife for the man on site. What ensued was a chaotic firefight that saw Gardner shot through the lung by guards before he took the life of an attorney, Michael Burdell, by shooting him. Gardner would take several hostages, including prison guards and even a vending machine serviceman, shooting and seriously wounding a bailiff before being made to surrender by armed police outside the building. Gardner would spend a quarter of a century waiting to be executed for his crimes, receiving life in prison for his murder of Otterstrom before being sentenced to death in 2010 for killing Burdell. His request for a final meal was hardly a one of everything on the menu list, but it was certainly pricey. Gardner intentionally fasted for 36 hours, only drinking liquids, before sitting down to his final dinner of expensive surf and turf, lobster tail, and steak. In addition, he was given a 7-Up to drink alongside and an apple pie with ice cream for afterward. He also made the request to be allowed to watch a showing of Lord of the Rings as he ate. Ronnie Lee Gardner would soon after be executed by firing squad, making him the third person in Utah to receive this penalty after the suspension of the death penalty was lifted in 1976. We hope you enjoyed Lord of the Rings even half as much as our next guy loves meat. It's often been said that it's hard to maintain being vegan or vegetarian since there's a scarcity of widely available and affordable options that fit those lifestyles. Luckily, there are at present a slowly increasing number of foods on the market for vegan and vegetarian folks, but the number of options tends to go up when it turns out a person has been lying about being a vegetarian the whole time. That brings us over to Stephen Michael Woods, who murdered a young couple in 2001, Ron Whitehead, who was 21, and Bethina Brose, who was 19. Both were shot multiple times in the head by Woods and had their throats cut as well. Yikes. Woods and an accomplice, Marcus Rhodes, were found to be in possession of personal items belonging to the couple, along with the murder weapons being uncovered at the home of Rhodes' parents. Multiple witnesses testified that Woods had spoken about his plans to commit the two murders and even spoke about his participation afterwards. While Marcus Rhodes was charged with capital murder and pleaded guilty, receiving life in prison, Stephen Woods was sentenced to death by lethal injection on August 27, 2002, in Texas, with his execution ultimately taking place on September 13, 2011. Despite having made earlier claims of being a vegetarian, Woods' final meal was full of meat, without so much as a fruit or vegetable in sight. Then again, he also claimed to have not killed Ron Whitehead and Bethina Brose, despite the evidence to the contrary. So maybe he just had a fraught relationship with the truth in general. His last meal consisted of 2 entire pounds of bacon, a large pizza topped with sausage, pepperoni, and every other type of meat you can imagine. He also had 4 fried chicken breasts, 5 chicken fried steaks, 2 hamburgers also topped with bacon, as well as French toast and garlic breadsticks with marinara on the side. Woods also received 2 pints of ice cream and a lot of sugary beverages to go with his meat-heavy meal, including 2 bottles of Mountain Dew, Pepsi, root beer, and sweet tea. If someone filmed this whole process, it would have been a video that was half Green Mile and half Epic Meal Time. There's a vintage YouTube reference for you. Woods wasn't the only one who wanted to do the do on his last 24 hours of Earth. The particularly despicable criminal Richard Cooey was sentenced to death for the sexual murders of 2 college students in 1986 and remained on death row for 20 whole years for a bizarre reason. By his own claim, at 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighing 270 pounds, he was too fat to safely execute. But sadly for Cooey, the state of Ohio found a way. When he was executed in 2008, he decided to go out with a meal that'd make your inner Cheeto dust-coated gamer proud. A T-bone steak with A1 sauce, onion rings, hash browns, french fries, toast with butter, 4 eggs over easy, a pint of Rocky Road ice cream, Bear Claw pastries, and Mountain Dew. When you're about to die, after all, it's not like you need to be watching your weight, right? We've got some even crazier examples to come, but at this point you might also be wondering, where did this tradition of the last meal even come from in the first place? Why do we give our most diabolical criminals a choice of a meal before going on to execute them anyway? It can't have just sprung out of nowhere, right? While some might misattribute this to the Last Supper within the Christian Bible, the tradition of giving a prisoner their final meal actually predates Christianity, dating all the way back to ancient Greece. Back then, it was likely born of the belief that a person sentenced to execution had to be fed so their spirit could cross over the river Styx without the risk that they would return from the underworld. Wouldn't want someone put to death to return as a vengeful, hungry ghost now, would you? This practice would later spread to ancient Rome, where gladiators were provided with a feast before the grueling experience of entering the Colosseum as a way to celebrate life before potentially facing death. Though personally, we're not sure we'd want to risk engaging in gladiatorial combat on a full stomach. You're supposed to wait at least 15 minutes, aren't you? That might actually be swimming. With this being a tradition going back to the ancient world, why isn't this video hours long with hundreds upon hundreds of crazy examples of last death row meals? Well, because some areas either saw this kind of thing coming or learned their lessons pretty quickly and put restrictions on the kinds of things that death row inmates can request. What kinds of restrictions, you might ask? Well, that depends on where in the country someone is sentenced and incarcerated while awaiting the death penalty. In Florida, for example, the maximum budget for a final meal is $40, while in Louisiana and Oklahoma it's less than half that amount. Certain requests are also denied due to prison restrictions, especially for those who might ask for alcohol or cigarettes to accompany their meal. Anytime a prisoner's request cannot be fulfilled, substitutions are usually made. So if someone on death row was to ask for a Wagyu steak or a lobster, they likely wouldn't get it, and someone looking to dine out on a sirloin steak might receive a hamburger patty. That's all the prison had on hand. So with that context out of the way, let's return to some more of those crazy last meals. We've certainly all known our share of picky eaters. Perhaps you, watching this at home, are even one. Remember how we said that sometimes prisons will make substitutions for items if they don't have them available? Well, this might be the story of the infamous instance of that ever happening. And it couldn't have happened to a pickier eater. Thomas J. Grasso broke into the home of an elderly woman from Tulsa, Oklahoma, named Hilda Johnson. On Christmas Eve of 1990, Grasso attempted to steal Johnson's cheap television set and a meager $12 from her purse and around the house. In order to do so, he murdered the 87-year-old woman with her own Christmas lights and bludgeoned her with an iron. Later in July of 1991, after selling Johnson's TV for only $125, Grasso would also murder Leslie Holtz, an 81-year-old man who lived in the same boarding house in Staten Island. Grasso then stole the man's social security check. He was given a life sentence in New York, where there is no death penalty. However, he would later be extradited back to Oklahoma for killing Hilda Johnson, pleading guilty to her murder and being sentenced to death in March 1995 as a result. This, technically, made Grasso's death the first execution of someone convicted in New York State in over 30 years. But for his last meal, Grasso didn't quite get everything he asked for. He certainly didn't hold back on ordering a veritable feast, requesting to be given 24 steamed mussels and 24 steamed clams, along with a double cheeseburger from Burger King and half a dozen barbecue spare ribs. He had not only one but 2 strawberry milkshakes to pair with his meal, as well as half of a pumpkin pie with whipped cream and diced strawberries. The real sticking point, though, the thing that really irked this multiple murderer and picky eater, was an issue over, of all things, SpaghettiOs. Yeah, you heard that correctly, SpaghettiOs. As part of his final meal, Grasso had specifically requested a 16-ounce can of SpaghettiOs with meatballs to be served at room temperature. Not even warm? Gross. However, the prison substituted this with regular canned spaghetti and meatballs instead, leading Grasso to become incredibly incensed. He was so aggravated by this substitution that in his final statement to the press before receiving the lethal injection, Thomas J. Grasso was quoted as saying, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this. Turns out there really is no pleasing some people." Of course, it'd be remiss of us to make a video on expensive last meal requests and not mention yet another prolific serial killer, John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, though he never actually killed anyone while dressed as a clown. His renown among his community in Chicago dressing up as a clown for local children might have garnered him a nickname that sounds like it was ripped straight out of a Stephen King novel, but don't let that fool you. Gacy was a monster of a man, one of the United States' most notorious killers, and guilty of some truly horrific crimes. In 1978, he was convicted of the murder of 33 teenage boys, 27 of whom he had buried in his backyard, and in the crawl space beneath his home in the Chicago suburbs. For 12 of his murders, Gacy was sentenced to death, having already been given life in prison for the others. His execution was appealed, albeit unsuccessfully, and the Supreme Court of Illinois ruled that he was to receive the death penalty by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Before his sentence was carried out, John Wayne Gacy would receive a last meal that mainly consisted of a large bucket of KFC original recipe fried chicken. During his life, Gacy had actually managed 3 KFC franchises in Waterloo, Iowa, an association that KFC was probably pretty upset about after all those murders came about. Alongside the fried chicken, he also had French fries, fried shrimp, and an entire pound of strawberries. Strangely, KFC and other fried chicken meals are a popular request among those on death row, with chicken fried steak being one of the most requested dishes in last meals. It's not the most requested final food, though. That title goes to ice cream. Yummy. Speaking of tasty frozen treats as a last meal, one of the most infamous domestic terrorists of all time had a hankering for something creamy and cold for his closing munch. In 1996, Timothy McVeigh committed the Oklahoma City bombing, where he filled a truck full of high explosives and detonated it next to a government building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, a crime for which McVeigh showed no remorse whatsoever. When he was executed in 2001, his last meal was 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. And personally, before he faced lethal injection, we hope he got brain freeze too. In the interest of balance, it's worth noting that some condemned killers end up ordering surprisingly Spartan last meals. For example, Eileen Wuornos, one of the rare female serial killers who killed as many as 7 victims, decided not to have a last meal and instead just ordered a cup of black coffee before her execution in 2002. This is similar to the last request of Fritz Haarmann, a frighteningly early 20th century German serial killer who was executed in 1924. As was the custom of German capital punishment of the time, he was only told his execution date the night before it happened. He was given an expensive cup of Brazilian coffee and a cigar before his head was chopped off by a guillotine. There are some last meals that leave you feeling the effects of eating them long after you're done. And for this next entry, the lasting after effects of his final meal would be felt not just by him, but by everyone else on death row in the state of Texas. Lawrence Russell Brewer was a white supremacist found guilty of murdering a black man named James Byrd in Texas in 1998. Along with his 2 equally contemptible friends, Brewer would beat and torture his victim before chaining James Byrd to his pickup truck, then driving the man, who was fully conscious during this time, 3 miles until he was killed by a curb and his body dismembered. A documented member of the Confederate Knights of America and the Ku Klux Klan, this vile individual was found guilty of a hate crime and sentenced to death on September 23, 1999. Brewer was to be executed by lethal injection on September 21, 2011, but it was his expensive and extravagant last meal that would send ripples through the state of Texas's prison system. He ordered 2 chicken fried steaks, along with a large bowl of fried okra, a triple bacon cheeseburger, 3 fajitas, a cheese omelet, and a pound of barbecue with half a loaf of white bread. He also requested an entire meat lover's pizza, 3 root beers to drink, as well as a pint of ice cream and a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts for dessert. And the kicker? Brewer didn't actually eat any of it. After requesting the elaborate spread, he then refused to have a single bite, wasting all of the food. The expense wasn't just monetary either. In fact, his disgusting actions would lead to Texas outright banning final meals for inmates on death row. And as of 2011, when Brewer was put to death, the state no longer fulfills requests for special meals. The state senator who called for an end to the practice, John Whitmire, went so far as to say, "If you're fixing to execute someone under the laws of the state because of the hideous crime that someone has committed, I'm not looking to comfort them." Perhaps the greatest insult of this case isn't just that Brewer ordered an extravagant meal and refused to eat it, meaning no other Texas prisoners were afforded the option of a last meal, but the fact is that this is what Brewer is remembered for. It's acknowledged far less often than his despicable, brutal hate crime that resulted in the death of James Byrd. But Lawrence Russell Brewer isn't the only infamous serial killer who didn't feel all that peckish before his state-mandated demise. One of the United States' most sadistic and infamous killers, Ted Bundy, didn't make any food requests before his execution by electric chair in 1989. Because of this, he got the default Florida death row meal of steak, eggs, toast with butter and jam, hash browns, coffee, and juice, all of which went to waste because Bundy decided not to eat any of it. He was causing trouble until the very end. However, when it comes to sheer death row gluttony, few can match the last meal of convicted murderer Peter J. Minial. After refusing a plea deal and sending his trial to a jury, Menial's devastatingly wrong miscalculation resulted in him landing on death row. However, despite his attempts to save his own life failing miserably, Menial decided he'd go out with style, or more likely an extreme case of acid reflux. He ordered 20 tacos, 2 kinds of ice cream, 20 enchiladas, 2 double cheeseburgers, fried chicken, pizza, and a fruitcake. If you're a particularly food-motivated person, you might now be thinking, that sounds pretty delicious, but you need some real impressive drinks to wash that down. You might be on the same wavelength as Menial because, in addition to all that grub, he also ordered orange juice, root beer, Pepsi, and Coca-Cola. Yummers. That brings us to maybe the most expensive last meal ever requested. In 2005, Robert Dale Conklin was scheduled to face execution in Georgia. He'd been on parole for armed robbery and fell into an altercation with George Crooks, an attorney who was reported to have been Conklin's lover. During the altercation, Robert Dale Conklin stabbed George Crooks in the ear with a screwdriver, wiggling it around and then later dissecting Crooks's body. Conklin wrapped the remains in garbage bags, leaving them in a dumpster outside his apartment, even putting some of the body parts down in a waste disposal unit. A book on dissection of the body was even found in Conklin's bedroom when the police investigated after a maintenance worker at the apartment complex discovered the dissected body parts, as well as a number of George Crooks's belongings inside the garbage bags. Conklin was condemned to execution by lethal injection, which was scheduled to take place on the 12th of July 2005, 21 years after the murder took place in 1984. Before receiving a sedative, a lung-paralyzing drug to slow his breathing, and a dose of lethal potassium chloride, Conklin was granted a last meal. And to call that a last meal might well be an understatement. It was an entire feast. For his last meal, Conklin requested and received a filet mignon wrapped in bacon, as well as shrimp sautéed in garlic butter with lemon. He also had a baked potato with butter alongside sour cream, chives, and bacon bits. Oh, and there was more. Corn on the cob, asparagus with hollandaise sauce, French bread with butter, and goat's cheese. For his dessert, Conklin had a cantaloupe, apple pie, and vanilla ice cream, and washed the whole lot down with an iced tea. Despite being thin in stature, Conklin ate everything, clearing 2 whole plates. To this day, his is still considered to be one of the most expensive, if not the single most expensive last meal requests. Now, is anybody else feeling hungry after hearing all this? It makes you wonder, what would your last meal be? There's no getting out of this. A pair of grimy handcuffs cut into your wrists. You shuffle along in your leg irons, questioning your life choices as you climb the bus stairs. A guard snarls at you from behind his aviators, and the reality starts to hit. You're about to do hard time. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we'll tell you what happens in the first 24 hours in prison. As you find a seat on the prison bus, you wonder how many people have sat here before you. It's just another day at work for the officers, but for you, it's the worst day of your life. You're frightened out of your mind. The little guy that sits down next to you is obviously as afraid as you are. You offer a timid smile and mumble hello, something you'll regret by this time tomorrow. You'll soon learn that in prison it's better to find out what someone's in for before you get friendly with them. No one speaks on what is the most uncomfortable journey of your life. A mean-looking prisoner glances your way, sizing you up. Every inch of you screams, "Victim." You're a lamb among wolves, but at least you've seen enough prison shows to know to keep your head down, so that's exactly what you do. After 3 long, agonizing hours, the bus pulls up outside of what'll be your home for the next few years. Looking through the window, you see a huge concrete structure surrounded by a mass of steel and razor wire fencing. One by one, you all shuffle off the bus. Armed guards pat each of you down. You're all herded through metal detectors into an indoor waiting area where a stony-faced guard takes off your handcuffs and shackles. All around you are glum faces. It's like a funeral. In a booking area, you answer some basic questions, and pointing to a room, a guard tells you what you've been expecting, dreading. First, that wedding band on your finger. It's gotta go. It has some stones in it in prison that could either gain you some serious leverage or get you a good beating. Your ring, your wallet, and keys are cataloged and put in a secure bag. They'll be placed in storage until your release. As for your cash, you're allowed $200 in your prisoner trust account, and another $200 will be added to your prisoner's telephone account. Strip, says the guard. Suddenly, you feel like all eyes are on you. You want to get this over with as quickly as possible. Now you're naked. You feel like an animal, an experiment. Any distinguishing marks, you're asked? Tattoos? No, but a scar on your left arm. It was a drunken skiing accident, you joke, trying to lighten things up, but the guard is not laughing. He records the birthmark on your backside. At least if you're beaten beyond recognition, they'll know who you are. The guard tells you to lift your arms. He sounds bored, like he's done this a million times before. It is the most humiliating few minutes of your whole life, and he's probably thinking about what he'll have for lunch. He motions for you to lift your testicles. You reluctantly comply. Could this get any worse? Oh yeah, it definitely could. It's time for the cavity search. You wonder if this is really necessary, as he tells you to squat and cough. You never even have smoked a joint, never mind rearranging someone's face with a butt-smuggled shiv. He runs his fingers through your hair and checks your mouth. This guard is way less friendly than the ones you've seen on TV. You get some slip-on shoes, a washcloth, 2 blankets, 2 sheets, a pillowcase, and some soap and shampoo. Back in the holding room, you wait. There will be a lot of waiting today. The same guard later appears and hands you an ID card with your prisoner number on it. 12947-027. You are a number, not a name. They take your picture and they fingerprint you. It's time for orientation. The guard tells you all the rules, a list of don'ts, and an explanation of what will happen if you do. Everything you do from now on, your every movement will be controlled and monitored. You are the property of the U.S. government. At least the nurses and medical staff are more friendly. They take your blood pressure and pulse and ask you questions about your health and the state of your mind. No, you're not withdrawing from addictive drugs. No, you've never self-harmed and you don't have any intention of doing so. After even more waiting around, a stressed-out-looking guy in a cheap suit asks you a series of questions. You're told it's of the utmost importance to answer honestly. He asks if you've worked for law enforcement. Any reason why you can't be in general population? Are you a gang member? The closest you've ever come to a gang is watching The Wire. The man asking the questions is polite and has a friendly manner. But one thing you still find it hard to get over is for them it's all in a day's work. And for you, it's a life-changing experience. A little later, your name is called. It's time to go to the housing unit. The guard takes you down a corridor. There are surveillance cameras everywhere. You get to a door and there's a loud buzzing sound followed by the clanking of a bolt unlocking. You walk through some more doors, fluorescent lights buzzing above your head, and suddenly you're in a yard surrounded by buildings. The guard points to a building at the other side of the yard. It looks like it was designed by Soviet-era architects. He tells you find the unit officer in there. You open the door and you're hit by the smell of floor cleaner and sweat. The noise is almost deafening, a mix of laughter, anger, and anguish. Men are sitting by tables in the main area, which is surrounded by 3 floors of cells. There's a net hanging in the middle. Sure, you've seen that on TV. You know why it's there. But right now, you really know why it's there. You were expecting to see bars, but the openings to the cells are doors with safety glass windows and a small metal flap. Prisoners are out on the landings, some are playing cards and chess. They all look at you as you walk over to the unit officer. It is the most intimidating walk of your life. You keep your head down but try to look confident. Don't act tough, but don't look weak. It goes through your mind that any one of these men could be a killer. They can smell your weakness from a mile away. Not for a second do you think any of them could be just like you, a regular person who made a mistake. At least they aren't shouting at you. This is not what you expected. No one is calling you a fish or wolf whistling or telling you that you'll be someone's boyfriend soon. Although you do hear someone say fresh meat. Too right, you are fresh meat. You're human wagyu to these guys. The prisoners seem to lose interest as you report to the unit officer. He gives you your cell details and tells you to go find it. Wait, you think there's no advice, no sympathy for the new guy? No affectionate pat on the back? There, new guy, don't worry, you'll be all right. Nope, he treats you like a hardened criminal. It hits you again, you're alone. These guards are not your protectors. They don't care where you come from or what you've done in your life. They're not going to stick up for you if someone gives you a hard time. You'll soon find this out the hard way. You reach the cell door. What are you supposed to do now? Knock? Walk right in? You wait outside. You can hear laughter behind your back, so you just walk in. There's a guy lying on a bed. He's about 45. Well, probably closer to 35, but with an extra 10 years of hard knocks written onto his face. The cell is dingy. Close to the door, there's a stainless steel toilet attached to a sink and a small counter. There's a paper plate on it. What are you supposed to say? Hi, how are you? 100 thoughts flash through your head. The good news is your cellie's appearance is skinny, pale, bald on top, ponytail in the back, and it doesn't immediately give you the impression he's a tough guy. Then there's a bang at the door. Your cellie motions with his eyes for you to open it, as if he knew this was going to happen. A heavily tattooed prisoner walks right in and tells you to show him your paperwork. Your cellie says under his breath, your charges. You get the feeling that his request is non-negotiable. Now you understand. You've heard about the convict code. KOS, kill on sight, for offenders who hurt women or children. You show the guy your papers and he laughs. You got 4 years for that, homie? It's true, 4 years for shoplifting is a harsh sentence, but not when it was your 11th offense for the same type of crime. You're a self-confessed kleptomaniac, a middle-class phone thief. Your lawyer tried to explain the psychological aspect at the trial, but the judge thought some prison time would do you some good. The guy hands you back your papers and walks out still smiling. Your cellie introduces himself as Chris, but people call him Nasty. He's got Nasty tattooed on his neck in italics, next to a love heart. He's saying something, but all you can think about is what does a man have to do to acquire the nickname Nasty? Nasty explains that the guy who just asked for your paperwork was sent by the shot caller, the boss who runs things in the unit. Disobey the rules and you'll be punished. You almost laugh, but quickly you realize that the convict code is how these men operate. You naively think you'll be okay because you never need to fight. Oh boy, you have a lot to learn. Nasty later tells you that he has to take a dump and now the cell doors are locked, so here comes another new experience in your short life so far. A grown man blasting a stainless steel bowl with salvos of fecal matter as you sit like a frightened child behind your bedsheet. Man, you think, I am never going to poop in here in front of him, never. Oh, you will. When you're called for dinner later, the chow hall is completely segregated. One of the strangest things about this whole experience so far is it's kind of like childhood, like school or scouts, but with a very grown-up addition of a sliced face as a punishment for a wrongdoing. The lights are burning bright. There's a constant din of conversation and laughter. People are looking at you. They glance up from their trays, give you a cursory inspection, and carry on eating. Guys push in front of you in the queue. It's not that you allow this, but what are you supposed to do? Start a fight over an extra few seconds wait? Nasty told you if someone punks you, you have to fight no matter what. If you don't, you'll be bullied your entire time here. You try to widen your shoulders and squeeze up close to the guy in front. He looks around and shoots you a penetrating stare. You step back and step on someone's foot. It's like primary school bullying, but with knives. After about 15 minutes, you get your food, a tray with what looks like a cardboard hamburger, a dollop of slimy mashed potato, dried out green beans, some kind of sugary juice, and what looks like a 3-year-old slice of ultra-mega processed cake. Oh, and there's an apple too, the only part of the meal that you completely trust. You get lucky and you find a space where you can sit alone. A prudent decision until you better understand prison politics. Just as you're finishing, that little guy from the bus sits next to you. Seems like the whole chow hall is watching. You have indoor recreation time from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. There's a gym, but it's only for daytime recreation. Same with the yard. Not knowing anyone to play chess or cards with, you go into a common room and watch Shark Week on the Discovery Channel. You hear a scream outside. Everyone rushes to the door to see what's happening. Your bus friend is on the floor, blood gushing out of his nose. Everyone sits back down as if nothing has happened. You wonder what the guy did to deserve what must have been a punch to the face. When you're both back in your cell, Nasty explains that the guy is a chomo. What? He hurt children. You think back to your interview this morning and wonder why this guy didn't ask to be put into protective custody or administrative segregation. The strangest thing is, Nasty somehow knows that you talked to this guy on the bus in the morning. News certainly travels fast. Now you've been associated with the very worst kind of prisoner, says Nasty. He takes a little piece of paper and attaches it to what looks like fishing line. It's actually dental floss. He then sticks something to it to give it weight. I wouldn't do this if you weren't my cellie, he tells you. Then he starts flicking his message under the cell door, and in a few minutes something comes back. He tells you he's taking a big risk doing this. Tomorrow, he says, you should make a call home to your wife. Get her to put $200 in this commissary account. He gives you the account details. You've befriended a chomo, punishable by a beating that you can now avoid by paying a shot caller. Nasty says he'll act as a go-between. He can protect you, for now. 9 p.m. is final count. You lie on the bed wondering how on earth you've managed to have such a bad first day. Thank God you've got someone as understanding as Nasty in the same cell. The lights are turned off at 11. The block is silent except for the occasional nightmarish shriek. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., you're called to the chow hall for breakfast. You look at no one as you eat your oatmeal and what tastes like powdered scrambled eggs. You also get milk and even more of that sweet juice. Later in the morning, you're told you can go to the yard. You stand in the middle of hundreds of prisoners, just waiting for a knife to be plunged into your neck. Staying in your cell, Nasty said, would elicit suspicion. At 11, you make a phone call, $11.35 for a 15-minute call from your prepaid account. You tell your wife you'll explain everything later. You return to your cell. It's empty. Nasty is gone. When you ask a prisoner, someone who seems genuinely friendly and sympathetic, what happened, he says that he asked to be put in segregation. You'll find out Nasty wasn't in for fighting on behalf of his girlfriend, like he told you, but for a scheme defrauding elderly people out of money. It just so happened that a grandson of one of the pensioners that he scammed managed to get himself transferred to this prison. He was planning to stick a shiv in Nasty. You tell the prisoner about the $200 you paid Nasty, and he starts laughing so much he almost falls over. That kid from the bus who was beaten up wasn't a chomo, he says. He just disrespected someone. He banged into a guy and didn't apologize. Your new friend tells you the first rule in prison is to be polite. After that, he says, don't lend, borrow, or gamble, and for God's sake, be careful who you trust. You have a lot to learn. Coordinated dances, karaoke, family rooms. When you think of prison, you think of the worst that society has to offer. But that's not what it's like everywhere. There are places around the world where criminals can enjoy video games, open kitchens, and privacy. Some of these places sound more like 4-star hotels than prisons, and we're going to share all the crazy details before answering the big question: is it better to treat prisoners with punishment or luxury? Cebu Provincial Detention and Rehabilitation Center isn't the most luxurious, but it makes our list due to the sheer celebrity status the inmates get to enjoy. In the Philippines, CPDRC offers recreational and creative exercises to the prisoners. You might have seen the videos of them floating around the internet. The inmates, dressed in bright orange jumpsuits, will line up in rows to dance in unison to popular music. The CPDRC's dancing inmates have put the prison on the map as a tourist destination. The dance numbers are televised, and civilian audiences are encouraged to watch. These prisoners have become so popular that people even ask for the dancers' autographs. Cebu is the one place you can go to prison and become a star, compared to prisons in LA where it's the other way around. It's important to note that CPDRC is a maximum security prison. It's a place where the most hardened killers are sent. It adds a whole new level of surrealism to watching 1,600 inmates dance in the prison yard. The tradition began in the mid-2000s thanks to CPDRC warden Byron F. Garcia. He'd wanted to liven up the fitness hour, and what better way to do that than dancing? When Garcia noted it led to an increase in good behavior and inspired camaraderie among the inmates, he continued having inmates dance for their exercise. He never planned to have them become internet celebrities. It hadn't even crossed his mind. He filmed the inmates dancing to Thriller and uploaded it to YouTube. He'd hoped other prisons might follow their lead since it had been working wonders. This video would get 6 million views in 3 weeks, and it would land at number 5 on Time Magazine's top 10 viral videos of 2007. Performances would become open to the public in April 2008. Garcia acts as the MC for the event, starting at 3 p.m. and going on for at least 2 hours with an intermission. During this, they'll perform about 15 dances to a variety of pop hits. The show ends with a flourish as Garcia invites audience members to have a prisoner-led dance session, followed by photo ops with the prisoners. Anyone who attends one of these dance performances will be sent home with souvenir photos and an orange t-shirt or collector's coffee mug. The whole affair ends for tourists when they return to the Capitol grounds by 6:30 p.m. If you go, be prepared to make a day of it. There is some controversy surrounding the whole affair. Obviously, having murderers and other dangerous individuals dancing around for accolades doesn't sit right with everyone, especially with their former victims or the friends and families of those victims. Miguel Cortez, a former psychology professor at the University of Manila, has questioned if it's actually a useful program. Instead of dancing, they could be learning technical skills that'll prepare them for life outside Cebu prison. Choreographed prison dancing isn't going to lead to too many job opportunities once they're outside again. Cortez argues that the actual needs of the prisoners are ignored for fame. Others are understandably upset at seeing criminality become a gateway to stardom. There are plenty of people who see bringing in tourists to watch them dance and taking home souvenirs as disrespectful to the victims of the inmates. When does it stop being a way to help prisoners refocus their energy and turn into a reward for bad behavior? The CPDRC inmates did take a brief break from their dance routines due to COVID-19. But if seeing those dancing inmates is on your bucket list, fear not, they made their return to the world in 2022. So if you're ever in the Philippines, you might want to take a little detour to watch Cebu's dancing inmates. Just try not to think too hard about the ethical quandaries. Now let's turn your eyes to Europe, starting with Norway's Halden Prison or Halden Fengsel. It's a maximum security prison situated in a sprawling forest. The inmates there have privacy and comfort. Prisoners can even enjoy a recreation room where they can watch television and movies or play video games, not to mention access to skill-building classes, a musical recording facility, and a gym. And many of these inmates are not sweethearts. There are murderers and rapists among their ranks, although a third of them are there for smuggling or drug-related charges, but the prison's dedicated to preparing to release these inmates back into the world once they've finished their sentence. In Norway, the maximum sentence is 21 years, regardless of your crime. Even Anders Behring Breivik, the terrorist who killed 77 people in a bombing and a shooting attack, is only serving 21 years. It explains the desire to focus on rehabilitation, though. Seems pretty important to keep people from reoffending. While many people see violence as just a part of prison life, violence is actually rare in Halden, mostly taking place in Unit A. Unit A is the most restrictive unit reserved for inmates with psychiatric or other medical issues that need to be monitored. It's also where the prisoners who committed crimes that would make them unpopular in Units B and C are kept. Halden enjoys dynamic security. It's a philosophy that centers on the relationship between inmates and staff as maintaining safety in this more lax prison setting. In the American prison system, they use static security. Static security works to prevent bad behavior in problem inmates. They minimize interactions with prisoners while watching them through cameras and using remote-controlled doors and shackles. The focus is on controlling the prisoner before violence can break out. Dynamic security, on the other hand, focuses on preventing bad intentions to begin with. The officers at Halden will spend time in the commons room with the inmates instead of segregating themselves. Staff engage in casual conversation and will even share a meal with the inmates, creating a sense of connection. There are security cameras on the prison grounds, but the guards don't follow them. The system believes building trust with the inmates is a must for them to improve in the long run. But curiously, they don't have the surveillance cameras in the commons rooms, cell hallways, cells, classrooms, or workshops. While it does sound like this would allow prisoners to run amok, it seems to have the opposite effect. Halden does have an isolation cell with a limb-restraining bed, but it's rarely used. In an effort to create normalcy, they even allow the inmates to have waffles. Waffles are a weekly treat in many Norwegian homes, which is why they have them once a week at Halden. Inmates will even make fine dining quality food in a professional-grade kitchen classroom to prepare them for release. This might be one of the only times people want to eat prison food. Bastøy Prison is a low-security prison that's also in Norway, with a similar approach to incarceration. It's just off the coast of the Oslo Fjord, and it's about 46 miles away from Norway's capital. Inmates are given cottages to live in while being expected to work on the prison farm. But they don't just work. They have access to tennis lessons, horseback riding, fishing, and sunbathing. The severity of the crimes committed by inmates in this prison are deadly and disturbing, but they all have the same punishment, the loss of freedom. The most interesting part is that it has the lowest reoffending rate in Europe. So maybe they're doing something right. Sweden has ideas about prison that are similar to those of its Norwegian neighbor. Sollentuna Prison, or Häktet Sollentuna, is a high-security prison that offers inmates private cells with comfortable beds and their own bathrooms. Much like Halden, they have an open kitchen and a recreation room with a television to watch. And how many prisoners can brag that they're eco-friendly? In 2019, Sollentuna won the BREEAM Public Projects in Use Award for its eco-friendly initiatives. The prison houses an 1,100 square meter green roof of plants and turf. The ventilation system recycles heat from the air, and the waste disposal room has 8 categories of waste. It's not just Sweden and Norway with luxurious prisons in Europe. Germany's home to JVA Fursbüttel Prison, a prison that's been criticized for giving prisoners too much freedom. Inmates live in expensive cells, and they have access to washing machines and telephones. Prisoners get to enjoy plenty of natural light, and they have access to conference rooms. They even redecorate the floors after short periods of time for inmates who have long sentences. Germany's neighbor Switzerland also has its own luxury prison, the Chapdalen Prison. It wasn't always on the list, though. In 2008, it was the most overcrowded prison. They refurbished it to allow triple occupancy cells with their own private bathrooms. After solving their overcrowding problem, the prison became more like a college dormitory. Prisoners are able to help one another through their rehabilitation while also having access to outdoor facilities and recreation time. While living in a dormitory isn't something people dream of, it is certainly better than a grimy prison cell would be. Next door in Austria, the Justice Center Leoben is considered one of the best prisons in the world. Now, it really is the five-star hotel of prisons. Each prisoner lives in what's basically a studio apartment with a private bed, bathroom, kitchenette, and television. And that's not all. Inmates have the ability to mingle at a basketball court, outdoor gym, and a space that's for walking and socializing. They can even go to the spa if they so choose. It's specifically for non-violent offenders, and it's home to only 205 inmates. You won't find murderers or kidnappers at Leoben. The idea was that since they committed minor offenses, they should still be punished, but not nearly as harshly as someone who did something far more heinous or deadly. In Spain, the Aranjuez prison is considered the prison for families. It's the only prison where infants are able to live with their imprisoned parents for the first few years of their lives. Cells are decorated with cribs, play areas, and cartoon characters are painted on the walls. This isn't the ideal situation for a child, but it beats being completely separated. Prison can tear families apart, especially when infant children are involved. Aranjuez prison's goal is to lessen that pain and offer stability for the children of criminals. An example of the prison's philosophy at work is with prisoner Carmen Garcia, who has been sentenced to 10 years for murdering her boyfriend. While in prison, she met and married fellow inmate Victor Lozano and gave birth to their son, Victor Manuel. In any other prison, Victor Manuel would be taken from her after birth to live with relatives or enter the foster care system. At Aranjuez prison, Garcia and Lozano are able to raise their son for the first few years of his life. At night, after a day of playing with the other children at the prison, the family will be locked up. Garcia acknowledges it as the saddest part of the day for her son. Once Victor Manuel reaches the age of 3, however, he will no longer be able to stay with his parents. He'll have to go live with relatives or social services will take over. His parents will then be sent to regular prison cells instead of the family cell. It may not sound as fancy as some of the other prisons in Sweden or Germany, but for a parent, it's an absolute luxury prison. Before you get too worried about the children, not everyone is approved for the family cells. If you've been convicted of crimes against children, for example, you won't be allowed in. So far, Europe has dominated all of the luxury prisons on our list, but other countries have followed suit. Near Milton, New Zealand, Otago Corrections Facilities aims to rehabilitate its prisoners. Inmates are given comfortable rooms and they can take classes to prepare them for life outside prison, like engineering, cooking, construction, and dairy farming. There are a few other prisons that have a holistic approach to dealing with criminals. In Bolivia, there's the San Pedro prison. In Indonesia, there's the Pondok Bambu prison. Pondok Bambu prison is a women's facility. The women are able to enjoy things like karaoke machines, gardens, and nail salons while inside. They believe that treating prisoners like human beings is what will lead to self-improvement and will lower their chances of reoffending. Novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky once said, "The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons." How much does society benefit from focusing on rehabilitation over punishment? It's understood that prison isn't meant to be fun, but does making it a grueling experience actually accomplish anything? Rehabilitation was a bigger part of the United States prison system until the mid-1970s. Prisoners developed occupational skills and were given opportunities to treat their mental health issues. Since then, America's adopted a tough-on-crime attitude toward law enforcement and criminal punishment. These days, most people see prison as a place where people are punished, not a place to better themselves. This basically had very little effect on crime rates. Instead, it led to immense growth in the prison population. There are over 2 million people in prisons or jail in the United States, while 4 to 5 million are on probation or parole. The United States has the highest prison population of any developed country. Between 15 and 20% of people in United States prisons are mentally ill. They've become de facto mental health hospitals for a lot of people while not being built to actually deal with a mentally ill population. But the prison system doesn't have enough mental health professionals to go around, and many of their resources go into mental health resources instead of rehabilitation. The conditions of prisons in the U.S. means that inmates are less likely to be rehabilitated and more likely to reoffend once they're released. That alone might be the answer to whether or not the prisons would benefit from more luxurious prisons we see like in Norway or Sweden. There's a massive amount of documentation that emphasizes the impact that child abuse, poverty, early exposure to substance abuse, or other risk factors have on criminal behavior. The key to crime prevention is individual-centered approaches, along with community support for potential criminals. In the 1970s, people began to believe that, quote, nothing works when it came to rehabilitation. It's how we ended up with our more punitive-focused prisons of today. However, it was greatly exaggerated since work programs education, and psychotherapy absolutely paved the way for prisoners to re-enter society in a productive fashion. The environment also shapes behavior. Create an environment where a psychologically healthy person might become sadistic or depressed, and you're only going to make the problem worse. It's how someone who went in on something as innocuous as taking drugs can come out even worse. People in super maximum security prisons often have high levels of anxiety and other negative emotions, and then they're sent out into the world without any kind of decompression or social or occupational skills to succeed. It's no wonder that the United States has the highest recidivism rates in the world. 44% of former inmates will return to prison within their first year of release. While these prisons we've looked at today seem overindulgent and luxurious, some of them seem to be onto something. Punitive prisons are a short-term solution that might cause more issues down the road, but places like Aranjuez or Bastoy might benefit society in the long run. And if you ended up down on your luck and in jail for something you did out of desperation, or even were falsely accused of doing, what kind of prison would you prefer to go to? Can you literally punch your way out of prison? Why can social media be a convict's worst enemy? And what happens when two people are handcuffed together and they try to make a run for it? All these questions will be answered and more, so hold on tight and be prepared to do a lot of head-scratching. Number 20. In 2012, perhaps history's most comical prison escape took place. The guys doing the escaping had done everything right, at the start at least. With painstaking perseverance, they dug a tunnel at a prison in Ceres, Brazil. This had taken them in quite some time, but then one day they were finally ready to make their move. One of the guys was Rafael Valadao, weighing around 224 pounds at the time of the escape. It should be noted he wasn't exactly tall. He was the second to go through, with a much smaller man going first. Behind him were some other guys. The problem was, due to Valadao's size, he got stuck, which left the guys behind him also stuck. When prison officers arrived on the scene, they didn't know whether to be serious or fall down laughing. Valadao had apparently broken a rib trying to fit through the hole, and this, it seems, was amusing to the officers. One of the firefighters who was then tasked with extracting him told the media the other prisoners tried to push him, but he stayed stuck in the wall. He started screaming in pain, and that was when the prison guards were alerted. A local cop explained he seemed to have underestimated the size of his stomach. It seems that the smaller guy actually got away, or at least that's what the report said at the time. Now for some pure, unadulterated dumb. Number 19. In 2013, an inmate at Hamilton County Jail in Tennessee, USA, cooked up a plan to escape. It was a simple plan, to say the least. That was to take another prisoner's ID, a prisoner that was about to be released, so that when that man's name was called, he would simply pass himself off as the other prisoner and walk out. Simple. The guy doing the escaping was named Kenneth Burnham, a white male standing at about 5 foot 7 inches tall. A guy whose ID he borrowed was named Glenn Taylor. Using this other ID and getting as far as claiming the other man's belongings, Burnham was almost out the door when a prison officer noticed something that didn't really look right. That was the fact that Burnham didn't look anything like the person whose ID he was carrying. Taylor was in fact an African-American male, and his height was closer to 5 foot 10 inches. When officers asked Burnham why he thought he could pass himself off as someone with a vastly different skin color, his reply was that he was so desperate to get out that he was being dumb. Can't disagree with that. This next one was equally dumb, but arguably twice as embarrassing. Number 18. In 2016, the media reported that a prisoner in Brazil thought about replicating his own version of the escape in the movie Shawshank Redemption. We don't know his name, but thanks to a video that appeared online, we know his method of escape. He had believed that if he took out the toilet bowl on his cell, he'd be able to escape through the sewer pipes. But unfortunately, all he got for his efforts was being covered in poop and a bunch of guards pulling him back out. That's kind of funny, but this next one certainly isn't. Number 17. As you might have seen in the movies, if you're going to dig an escape tunnel, one of the things you need to do is ventilate the place, or you might find yourself struggling to breathe. That was what happened in 2018 to a 25-year-old Brazilian man named Judson Cunha Evangelista at the Monte Cristo Penitentiary in northern Brazil. This guy did everything right at the start, spending months digging a tunnel during the nights and covering the entrance to the hole during the day. He managed to dig an impressive tunnel that was 230 feet long and reached all the way to the outside. It seems one night he'd been digging but was struggling to breathe, so he scurried as fast as he could back to his cell. He died anyway from an acute lack of oxygen. Prison authorities said Evangelista, a convicted murderer, had dug his way past the towering prison walls and under electrified fences and only had a few feet left to get to a forest at the time of his death. An investigation showed that the plan had been not only to get himself out, but to charge other prisoners for the use of his tunnel. The next one we'll put down to karma. Number 16. We guess some of you feel a bit sorry for these people whose lives haven't gone the way they wanted, but you also have to remember some of them have committed terrible crimes. That was the case with a U.S. woman named Jessica Boomershine. On January 15, 2020, she and an accomplice were at a casino in the U.S. and had their eye on an 85-year-old man. They followed him home, and when there, they managed to secure the guy's firearm. They proceeded to fire off some bullets and told the man that he was going to take a trip. At gunpoint, they took him to an ATM, and following some more rough treatment, they forced him to draw out a load of money. After taking a large sum of cash from his account, they then locked him in the trunk and left him at a waste facility. He could have easily died there if he hadn't been able to find the emergency release switch and get out and find some help. It didn't take the police long to find Boomershine, not the world's smartest criminal. While in a holding cell at the police station, she thought she'd try and break out through the ceiling. In short, the roof collapsed on her and officers pulled her down, taking her pants down at the same time. If there's a fitting end to the story, she landed right in a garbage can. Later in court, the judge sentenced her to 25 to 30 and a half years in prison. Number 15. This next man was described as one of Australia's most notorious convicts. His name was George Savas, and he was a drug baron. What makes his escape stupid is what he did after, not the escape itself. In July 1996, he was being visited in prison after getting a hefty sentence for trying to import 80 kilos of heroin into Australia. On that particular visiting day, he managed to slip on a wig, plus a fake mustache and a beard, and proceeded to walk right out, and no one batted an eyelid. This was a job well done and an embarrassment to the Australian authorities, and you'd think Savas would have kept his head down after that, but nope, it seems he still wanted to eat at one of Sydney's swankiest restaurants, and this was a well-known criminal whose face had been all over the newspapers. He was halfway through his steak when the police arrived, finding 1 gram of cocaine on him too. He was sent back to prison, where just a few months later another escape attempt of his was foiled. This one had been planned with one of Australia's worst serial killers, Ivan Milat. It seems the prison had guessed these guys had some kind of plan and had used recording devices as well as undercover agents to foil the plot. The plan had been to overpower officers, get over the wall, and drive away in a getaway car. They'd prepared for violence, with the authorities saying they were prepared to injure or kill anyone who got in their way. Just hours after the plot was discovered and the men were given a good talking to, Savas was found dead in his cell. But if you need to hear any story about Australian escapes gone wrong, it is this next one. Number 14. The prison was the notorious penitentiary at Port Arthur in Tasmania. The place started off as a penal colony where Brits who had acted badly ended up, if indeed they survived the long journey across the ocean. It was also, for the worst of the worst, those who had committed an offense even after they arrived in Australia. With that in mind, you can imagine that this place was no walk in the park. The authorities said it was impossible to escape from, and if someone tried, you can bet they'd suffer some serious physical and mental torture. It was a horror prison, and that's why it's been compared to Alcatraz in the US. This brings us to a Scotsman named George Billy Hunt. He was transported to Australia and ended up at Port Arthur for the offense of stealing a handkerchief. If you thought that was bad, the Edinburgh News wrote in 2018, other crimes variously were feloniously, willfully, and diabolically interfering with a dog, having lollipops in his possession. We don't know much more about Billy Hunt, but we do know that he attempted to escape the only way possible, which was through a mass of land nicknamed the Neck. To do that, he needed a disguise since the place was crawling with armed guards and vicious dogs. So Hunt killed a kangaroo and got inside its skin. He then hopped out of the prison and into the Neck. That's pretty clever, but let's just say he hadn't thought much about what would happen next. It seems the guard saw this kangaroo and was thinking it was a real living animal, and they got their guns ready to shoot it. Hunt saw this and got out of the suit and put his hands up. A report stated Hunt was dressed as a kangaroo and was attempting to hop to freedom, only to be shot at by rationed soldiers who had grown accustomed to hearty kangaroo stews. Hart was charged with absconding and given 150 lashes of the whip. The moral of the story is if you're going to escape inside a dead animal, make sure that it's one humans don't hunt and eat. With this next one, it's also not so much the stupidity of it, but again the sheer absurdity. Number 13. It involved a gang leader in Brazil who was serving 73 years behind bars for drug trafficking. His name was Clavino da Silva. With that kind of sentence, a person can get desperate. Desperate he must have been in 2019 when he was visited by his 19-year-old daughter. She came in and handed her father not just a wig or a fake beard, like the less modern folks would do, but she handed him a quite advanced-looking silicone mask to cover up his entire head. Silva was immediately transformed into a teenage girl, although you wouldn't say the disguise was very believable. The guards didn't fall for it, and they made him take off the mask. So yeah, we think it was pretty stupid to believe he could get away with it, but it's even worse when you consider how strict Brazil's authorities are and the fact that there was no backup plan for his daughter. She would have been charged with trying to help her father get out of prison, of course. She wasn't the only person involved though, with the prison authorities later saying 9 people had helped sneak the mask in and the clothes. Now let's talk about one of the greatest escape artists of all time, a man that did everything right until he made a fatal mistake. Number 12. His name was Yoshi Shiratori. It's hard to call him stupid since he managed to escape from prison 4 times, but it's what he did after his last escape that we must question. More so since he knew if he got caught he was going to be executed. During his 3rd escape attempt, he killed a farmer while stealing a tomato, and that landed him in Sapporo prison. Because he'd escaped before, he was placed in an isolation block in a special cell, but there he took his time and dug a tunnel using small soup bowls, apparently somehow redistributing the earth somewhere else. Sometime after he got out, he was in a park. It was there that a police officer, not knowing who Shiratori was, offered him a cigarette. The year was 1948, and smokes were seen as a luxury in Japan. This act of kindness apparently moved Shiratori so much that he told the cop who he was. Bad move. Soon after, he was standing in the High Court of Sapporo, expecting to be told that he was going to be executed. But good fortune was on its way. The court ruled that he'd killed that farmer in self-defense and reversed his death sentence. He still served another 14 years, but in the end, it was his heart that killed him, not the justice system. As for this next one, well, we have no idea what was going through that prisoner's mind. Number 11. Carlos Garcia, a convicted murderer, was doing time at a prison in southeast New Mexico. He decided it was time to go and so got to work on removing the window in his cell using only a razor blade attached to a popsicle stick. This was months of work, and when he did manage to cut through most of the window, he was smart enough to use a plastic sheet and some more popsicle sticks to make it look as though the real window was still in place. Then one night in 2012, he pushed out the fake window and using bed sheets scaled down 2 stories. Now he was almost a free man, but for some reason that we might never find out, he changed his mind and climbed back up the sheets and back into his cell. One of the prison officers told the media, "In the 14 years I'd been here, we never had an incident like that." Before you hear this next one, ask yourself what kind of vehicle you'd like to have if you ever got as far as over the prison walls. Number 10. In 2019, a 44-year-old prisoner named Curtis Ray Watson almost succeeded in gaining his freedom after a brutal breakout in Tennessee. Watson was a dangerous man indeed and was serving a 15-year sentence for beating and detaining his wife in 2012. He was violent again during his breakout years later when he strangled and killed a female prison officer. He was eventually caught and given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But what's so strange in this story is the vehicle he used to make his escape. It was a tractor, which you have to admit wasn't the best choice. Maybe this next one, though, shows that there's also a downside to running during an escape, even though you might not stand out as much as you would chugging down the road in a tractor. Number 9. In 2011, a prisoner named James Edward Russell managed to take off from Washington State Penitentiary, where he'd been serving time for theft and forgery. These were not serious offenses, and it seemed that Russell was doing his time in part of the prison that served as a minimum security work camp. It made it pretty easy for him to get away, and he went off, running apparently like a professional athlete. Media reports state he got as far as 14 miles in no time at all, but as he approached some houses in the woods, he realized he had a problem on his hands. That was the fact that he was still dressed in his prison uniform. We have no idea what was going through his mind, but it seems his plan was to knock on one of the doors and ask to use the phone, after which he'd get someone to pick him up and hopefully the owner of the house wouldn't make a fuss. So he went ahead and knocked. He was then about as surprised as the person that opened the door, seeing as the man was a prison officer who was more than familiar with that prison uniform. Russell made a run for it through the woods but was eventually caught sometime later in the morning. If you thought that one was funny, this is going to make you choke on whatever you're eating. Number 8. Let's imagine Scooby-Doo and Shaggy were convicts in a cartoon. Wrongly accused, of course, because they're nice guys. But still, if they were arrested, you could expect some slapstick comedy, maybe something like them being handcuffed together and at some point trying to run in the opposite direction. No one would be that stupid in real life, right? Well, something similarly silly did happen once in real life. Let us explain. The year was 2009, and 2 male prisoners named Regan Retty and Tiranara White were about to appear at the Hastings District Court in New Zealand. At some point during their transportation, they realized that there was a chance to run. The only problem was they were handcuffed together. As it turned out, running away in tandem is as hard as Scooby and Shaggy might have made it seem. Like a fail from hell, these 2 geniuses ran on opposite sides past a pole. A police officer later explained how they managed to do this, saying they fell over and were sprayed with pepper spray. But then they got up and ran out of the court onto the street, across the road into a car park, and that's where they met the pole. It was all over. We guess they might have been partially blinded, but a New Zealand TV news show still called it one of the worst escape attempts ever seen. The next escape attempt is just as daft, if not worse. Number 7. In 2012, 19-year-old Carlos Pereira and 24-year-old Sidney Da Cruz were involved in one of the crummiest prison escape attempts of all time at the Delegacia de Furtos jail in Curitiba in southern Brazil. The two waited until lunchtime was over and simply climbed into the trash bags. How those bags were tied from the outside was a bit of a mystery, although it's thought a prison officer could have been on the escape. The two couldn't keep still, and an officer noticed that the bags seemed to be breathing. He later told Brazilian media, "At first I thought there was a rat, but on closer inspection I could see it was two inmates disguised as bags." So that was indeed a rubbish attempt to get out of jail. But this next one would have been great had the escapee thought a little bit more about logistics. Number 6. In 2010, a prisoner named Michael J. Norwood at the Snake River Correctional Institution in Eastern Oregon did everything right. He could have had a movie made about him if he'd just been as practical as he was creative. This guy made one of the best prison dummies on record, if not the best. He used his own hair for the dummy, and he sculpted a fine head using peanut butter. It wasn't just a head either. He made the entire dummy the same size as himself, and then he clothed it. Norwood, who was 41 at the time and in prison for burglary, had spent weeks designing his masterpiece. An investigation showed he'd also made a rope out of a lot of saved dental floss, which he intended to throw over the prison fence. He used book covers and toilet paper tubes to make a kind of hook that would keep the rope in place. On the big day, he went out to the yard of Complex 3. That's where he intended to stay out of sight. Meanwhile, his dummy was left lying in his bed with a pair of headphones on. Okay, this all sounds like a top-notch escape plan. Why are we calling it stupid? The reason is he just stayed in the yard. He hadn't planned on how he'd get to the fence, or even if he did, he hadn't planned how he'd get away through the open fields. No one on the outside knew about his escape. So he just waited there, and then, through some loudspeakers, he heard one of the officers saying, "What the hell are you doing? Get back inside right now." When asked about this part of the plan, Norwood later freely admitted that he hadn't really thought about part 2 of the escape. He was charged $132 for the 6 library books he'd torn up to make the hook, and he also got 180 days in solitary. This next one is so absurd, you'd think someone made it up, but we can assure you it happened. Number 5. This bizarre escape attempt happened in 2016 at a prison in Luzerne County in Pennsylvania. A prisoner named Alexander Scaramastro was in the midst of being transported when he ran from parole officers and into a waiting car. Inside that car was 21-year-old Luciano Ramos. Witnesses later said they'd heard Scaramastro shout, "Go, go, go!" So off they went. Almost. Because a probation officer named Jim Allardyce got in the way, he was hit and suffered some not-so-serious injuries. What happened next is confusing. Ramos stopped the car and ran to a police station where he screamed that a bunch of men had just tried to carjack him. He obviously thought he could get the cops to arrest the parole officers, which was a pretty stupid thing to assume. When the police officers went to the car, they found Scaramastro sitting in there surrounded by some very angry parole officers. The police officers talked to the parole officers and discovered that Scaramastro was trying to escape from prison. Ramos then told them that he had no idea about Scaramastro's plan and he just picked up his buddy when someone tried to steal the car. Then Scaramastro snitched on Ramos, showing officers text messages which proved they both planned the escape. The two went straight to jail, of course, and you can bet that Ramos cursed himself for ever getting involved. This next might win the award for most pointless prison escape of all time. Number 4. In 2016, a man named Christopher Boscacci tried to get away from California's Elmwood Correctional Facility in Milpitas, and he actually didn't do a bad job. He was somewhere outside in the minimum security area when he climbed on a building and then shimmied his way to the fence. He got over not one fence but 2, going so fast he left his prison-issue slippers hanging up there. It all came to an end when he fell, and when he did so, it was right into the arms of prison officers who'd been told about this Spider-Man-like character since the entire thing was being watched on a CCTV. 25-year-old Boscacci was taken to a hospital with some slight injuries and was later charged with felony crime of trying to escape from jail. Okay, so what's so stupid about this? The answer is this guy was in jail for a misdemeanor crime of petty theft, and he was due to be released in 2 or 3 days had he not tried to make the escape. We guess he must have had a very good reason for doing that. Maybe he left the oven on. Let this next one be a lesson to all you desperados out there that can't get through one day without telling strangers what you're doing and where you are. Number 3. In 2008, a man named Chris Crego found himself in a typical alcohol-sodden situation in a bar just outside Buffalo in the USA. Another drunk guy said those familiar words, "Let's take this outside," or something to that effect, and Crego, not one to waste an opportunity to use his fists and impress his buddies, took up the guy on the challenge. Seems he didn't just use his fists, with the other guy taking one in the head with a beer bottle. That ended with Crego in handcuffs and in the back of a police car. Police later said he caused serious injuries to the man. The damage to the victim was so bad it resulted in surgery. Crago also got charged with possession of marijuana and driving while drunk. He eventually pleaded guilty to the crime of assault, but when it came to the sentencing day, he just didn't show up. He was due to serve just over a year in prison, but it seemed that he thought the justice system had been a bit unfair to him. Explaining the fight, Crago later said, "All I did was slap him." That's why he left the state of New York and headed to Indiana. He might have stayed hidden had he not kept posting updates about his whereabouts on MySpace and Facebook. Cops looked at these pages and then got an extradition warrant. Yet again, Crago thought he'd been hard done to, later stating, "Getting a governor's warrant extradition on a misdemeanor is about as common as getting the death penalty over a speeding ticket." The police later confirmed to the media that it's quite common to catch criminals by using social media, just because folks seem to think that if it's not public, the posts are safe from the prying eyes of law enforcement. Crago eventually got out in 2011, admitting that a drunken scuffle in a bar had cost him dearly. He's since been called the Facebook fugitive. This next one we'll call the most basic escape attempt of all time. There's nothing fancy here, but you have to credit the man for trying to do the impossible. Number 2. The star of this story is Hector Luis Campos, and when he was 22 years old in 2011, it seems he would have done anything to get out of Osceola County Jail in Florida, USA. It was about 4 in the morning when the night shift officers started hearing a banging noise, but at first they had no idea where it was coming from. It would start and then stop for a while, and then start again. They wondered if some construction was going on somewhere. Then they followed protocol and walked around checking the cells. But it seemed that nothing was out of place. The prisoners were busy snoring the night away, so the officers agreed the banging must have been nothing. Then it came again. Thun, thun, thun. What the heck, the officers thought. One of them said it sounded as if the banging was coming from the cells which housed inmates who'd been put under closer supervision. So they kept an eye on each of the TV screens that showed the insides of those cells. It was then that they noticed in one particular cell, their view was a bit obscured by what looked like a sheet. The officers went down to check, and there they found Campos sitting down on his bed with a very bloody, very swollen hand. They pulled back the sheet and discovered that some of the bricks around the door frame were broken, and when they looked in the toilet bowl, they found bits of paint and mortar. Campos had quite literally been trying to punch his way out of prison, a futile task if there ever was one. A spokesperson told the media his hand is very sore right now. We've saved the best for last, as we always do, and we're sure you will admit that no prison breakout story can top this. Number 1. In 2010, some of you might have stumbled across a rather outrageous newspaper headline that read, "Gun-toting Snoopy attempts to free inmate from British jail." The jail in question was on the Isle of Wight, a small island that's about 5 miles off the south coast of England. There are about 140,000 people living on the island, but it's certainly not the kind of place you associate too much with serious crime. For that reason, you would assume that the jails there have pretty lax security. This is what a couple of daring guys must have thought when they entered the jail and started threatening the staff with what appeared to be a gun. One man was wearing normal clothes and the other was dressed like that lovable old beagle, the best friend of Charlie Brown, Snoopy. Their ages were given as 43 and 21. Reports don't say, but we're assuming the older man was Charlie and the younger dude was Snoopy. The prison officer later said it's not every day you see a giant cartoon dog going on the rampage after trying to break into prison. The guys started threatening the staff, throwing rocks around, smashing up cars, trying to beat down the prison door. They were obviously trying to get in to get a guy out. That officer said they weren't exactly inconspicuous, but it was taken seriously because they appeared to have a gun. They caused a real commotion, and it was only later found that they were to be armed with a water pistol. So we have a cartoon dog and his best pal armed with a plastic water-firing gun. Could this escape get any more comical? The answer is yes. That's because this prison has 2 different locations, one called Albany Site and the other called Camp Hill Jail. They arrived at Albany, but the guy they wanted to bust out was at Camp Hill. According to someone familiar with everyone involved, the 2 men were related to the imprisoned man. He said they are very close together, but this has got to rank as one of the worst attempted jailbreaks ever. We won't disagree. It seems the British authorities didn't take the matter too seriously, and instead of arresting the men for any kind of crime, they were both detained under the UK's Mental Health Act. That was probably the right decision. In the year 1946, from May 2nd to May 4th, one of the bloodiest escapes in history was attempted at the prison nicknamed Alcatraz. One of the 6 escapees had purposefully starved himself and is able to squeeze through the bars to give him access to a gun gallery. Now armed, the prisoners force guards to open up the isolation cells. What ensues is the Battle of Alcatraz, a furious fight that ends with 2 officers dead and 14 officers wounded. 3 prisoners are also killed, and 2 are later executed for their participation in the battle. What could have driven men to become so desperate and so violent? This is what we'll try to figure out today. That wasn't the first escape attempt from the prison that even the most hardened criminals feared, and it wouldn't be the last, in spite of the fact that trying to get out of Alcatraz was an extremely deadly ambition. Even if the prisoners did get to the beaches surrounding the fortress of Alcatraz, there was every chance that their dead bodies would end up being scooped out of the frigid waters sometime later. First, we'll come back to these insane escape attempts and perhaps one that was successful. But first, we need to ask ourselves this. If trying to escape statistically gave the prisoner a good chance of being shot or designated missing and presumed drowned, why did they keep trying? What was so bad about Alcatraz? Long before this place was called the end of the line for difficult criminals, it was used as an army barracks and then a military prison. In 1934, it became the property of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, with the authorities hoping it could contain some of the most vicious and difficult criminals in the USA. From 1920 to 1933, the country had experienced a devastating rise in crime because of a harebrained thing called the Prohibition, with crime rates going up in 30 major U.S. cities by 24%. This war on one of the most popular drugs wreaked havoc on society. And then, if things weren't already bad enough, starting in 1929 and lasting for a decade was the Great Depression. It was a bad time to be an American if you came from one of those places they called the other side of the tracks. So this was the climate when Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary first opened its doors to who the authorities said was the worst of the worst, the criminals that were almost beyond rehabilitation. These were the folks that were labeled the incorrigibles. If you were a criminal back then and deemed a menace to the prison where you were already incarcerated, one day you could have been knocked up early in the morning and told you were getting a transfer. After that, you'd been taken to a specially designed train coach where you were shackled and handcuffed with a bunch of other prisoners, not to mention surrounded by around 60 FBI agents and U.S. Marshals. All you would have known is that this was big. Something big was happening, but you'd have no idea you were being taken to a hellhole like no other. At a place called Tiburon, just north of San Francisco, you'd have been taken by barge to San Francisco Bay. Never in your life would you have seen so many armed guards, although almost every prisoner with you has a solid reputation as being what the authorities called an agitator. It's at the Bay that you catch your first glimpse of the warden and his assistants, who, due to their stern reputations and dogged toughness, have been nicknamed Iron Men. Once on the island, these men march you and the others single file to where you're stripped and searched, after which you're given a number and told which cell block you're going to. For you, it's cell block B, although at some point during your stay you'll likely end up in cell block D, the dreaded isolation block. You walk into your cell and feel a sense of dread, measuring 5 feet by 9 feet and fitted out with one steel bed and one steel shelf. Your entire worldly possessions amount to a toothbrush, some tooth powder, 2 towels, and a cup. What's strange is the silence, a very eerie silence. You've been told not to speak, but it's just strange that no one is. The last prison was nothing like this. Things become a bit clearer when you read the book that's been given to you entitled Regulations for Inmates USP Alcatraz. Inside, you read that your life won't be hard with a good conduct record and a good work record. In Section 5, it says you are entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Anything else that you get is a privilege. And let's just say they are deadly serious when it comes to taking your privileges away, which is one reason why people will soon be literally dying to get off that rock of Alcatraz. You'll learn that you might be working hard, and anything that gets in the way of that is a very serious offense. In fact, many things seem to constitute a serious offense, from mere loitering to loaning things out, especially gambling or talking back to the guards. The book explains that the morning bell goes off at 7 a.m., after which you will get ready and be standing by your cell door facing outward at 7:20 a.m. No noise is permitted, not even a whisper, and don't you dare look to your side once you're out of the cell. You will walk to the dining hall in single file, you cannot chat with the other prisoners, and you should not switch your place in line. Do not, it says, indulge in horseplay. Damn, you think, are they serious about this? Then you read in capital letters, you may be stopped and searched at any time, do not attempt to carry contraband. But things get a bit better, at least if you don't break the rules. There is a movie day twice a month, and if you're especially good, you might be allowed to play sports in the yard, at least after you finish your 30-day quarantine period when you arrive at Alcatraz. Just get your work done 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, keep your cell clean, don't talk when you're not supposed to, and you'll get some of those privileges. So far, Alcatraz just sounds like a really strict prison, but some of the things we just mentioned drove some of those prisoners half mad, and sometimes seriously medically mad. They really weren't supposed to talk in their cells, ever, or at least when one warden was in charge. That total silence was deafening, and if anyone was caught trying to whisper a message to another prisoner, they could end up losing their privileges or even take a trip to D Block. the home of the notorious Hole. The only time they could talk, except from when they were out in the yard, was when they were eating, and this living half their life in silence was not easy at all. The good news is the food was pretty good, with one of the wardens saying if a prisoner gets the right food, he'll be much more useful at work and less prone to acting out. This was on the menu for one Alcatraz breakfast: oatmeal, milk, sausage, fried potatoes, toast, and coffee. For dinner, they got bean soup, roast beef, and veg. For supper, they got pork and beans, salad, spiced apples, and more coffee and bread. The prisoners got some recreation time in the yard on weekdays, although just a few minutes. On Saturdays and Sundays, they got a good chunk of the morning in the yard and a couple hours in the afternoon. It was the same with public holidays. On top of that, many prisoners who didn't break the rules got to use the public library, with the average Alcatraz prisoner getting through 70 to 100 books a year from a stockpile of 10,000 to 15,000. So it wasn't all bad news getting sent to Alcatraz. 1 year after the prison opened its doors to around 240 prisoners, the Bureau of Prisons issued a report stating, "The establishment of this institution not only provided a secure place for the detention of the more difficult type of criminal, but has had a good effect upon discipline in our other penitentiaries also. No serious disturbance of any kind has been reported during the year." Okay, so why did this place become known as Alcatraz? That's what you want to know. Well, first of all, there was what the Bureau of Prisons was saying and what the prisoners said. The writer of that report we just mentioned there must have decided to skip the guard brutality part of life in Alcatraz. As you know, if prisoners towed the line, they were paid back in privileges. But you haven't heard about what happened when someone didn't toe the line. If you think breaking the rules wasn't easy to do, just imagine having to stay silent for hours on end. Imagine staying silent when a guard has his knees in your back and another is pummeling you over the head. Imagine trying not to speak when some dude is trying to extort you. Or just imagine keeping quiet when you just need to hear a voice when you're at your lowest depth and there's a guy next door to you. So, soon after it was opened, critics of Alcatraz were saying this was a project that just couldn't work. One of them called the place a great garbage can of San Francisco Bay, into which every federal prison dumped its most rotten apples. He, like the others, said when you dump a lot of desperate and broken men into one place, something sinister will start to happen. Alcatraz, they said, is a pressure cooker, a human time bomb. Even though the population was usually only 260 to 275 people, and it rarely went above 300, you have to remember that this 1% of the entire US prison population at the time was often a violent bunch. The way to fix this, according to the authorities, was stricter measures, but these were men like Cool Hand Luke, in that you just couldn't reach them. One of them was Robert Stroud, aka the Birdman of Alcatraz. Prior to arriving in Alcatraz, he'd murdered a prisoner in another prison and later killed a guard. This guy spent 54 years in prisons in total, 42 of which were in solitary confinement. In prison, he taught himself a lot about birds and actually became a fairly well-respected ornithologist, although he didn't actually keep birds in Alcatraz. In his former prison, he wrote the book Diseases of Canaries. But now in Alcatraz, and because of his violence, it was decided the way to rehabilitate him would be to deprive him of the things he most treasured. This was the Alcatraz way, and there's a good argument to suggest that it does not work. Stroud had run away from home at the age of 13 to escape a very violent father. He was obviously traumatized, and it was in prison where he seemed to get even more violent, so the authorities deemed him one of those incorrigibles. He was no doubt a dangerous prisoner, but you have to ask if the treatment he got at Alcatraz was a good thing. The man, who was later called a brilliant self-taught expert on birds and possibly the best-known example of self-improvement and rehabilitation in the US prison system, all that stopped at Alcatraz. Instead, he was called a psychopath and kept well away from birds. The silence was deafening in the normal cells. The isolation block was like living in outer space. There were 36 segregation cells as well as solitary confinement cells. These were called the Hole. Here, prisoners often spent a grand total of 24 hours a day locked up, sometimes in the dark. Yeah, not even 1 hour out on most days. But they at least were taken to the yard at some point in the week. When that happened, the only other people in the yard were the guards. If they were following orders not to make chit-chat with the prisoner, that man never really got to talk to anyone. This is how you make men insane, which doesn't sound like rehabilitation or such a good thing for when some prisoners are released back into the public sphere. While in the Hole, they didn't receive visits from the outside. Unlike prisoners in other blocks that got one visit per month if the warden granted them one. Even then, the prisoners and the visitors weren't allowed to touch each other and were not supposed to talk about current events or life in the prison. The former prisoner, Jim Quillen, has written about Alcatraz and the Hole, and he didn't have much good to say about either. He was sent to Alcatraz in 1942 after not exactly being a model prisoner at San Quentin. In his book Inside Alcatraz, he explains the reason why people were sent there, saying, "Rehabilitation was not part of the Alcatraz vocabulary or even considered. The institution was there for the purpose of proving to unruly prisoners that they had reached the ultimate termination of their undisciplined way of life." On the day he arrived, he was greeted by a straw mattress and a dirty pillow. He couldn't believe how quiet it was, but did say he kept hearing whispers of the word fish. Apparently, prisoners were excited that some fish had come into the prison. On that first night, he wasn't undressed and in bed as fast as he could have been. The guard walked up to his cell and said, "Get undressed right now or you'll be able to see what the hole feels like." In the end, Quillen did spend time in the hole. That consisted of 24 hours a day in the pitch black. Food was shoved in now and again, and aside from the sound of scurrying rats, there was total silence. This is what Quillen said he did to keep sane. "When I'd go in the hole, what I used to do was I'd tear a button off my coveralls. I'd flip it up in the air, then I'd turn around in circles, then I'd get down on my hands and knees, and then when I found the button, I'd stand up and I'd do it again." Other reports say men were sometimes beaten before they were stripped of their clothes and thrown into the cold floor. They were given no toothbrush or soap, although once a week a guard might appear to throw cold water over the prisoner. This was all designed to dehumanize the man, to make him feel like an animal. In the worst of the cells, known as the Oriental, there was a hole in the ground through which the men could pee and defecate, which gave the place a smell of sewer. They didn't poop that often anyway, seeing as the only thing they were given to eat were slices of moldy bread along with some water. It wasn't easy to stay out of the hole, never mind how good a prisoner's record was. As one former prisoner explained, men go slowly insane under the exquisite torture of restricted and undeviating routine. The wardens sometimes weren't even the biggest problem. Such was the case of a prisoner named the Rufa Percival. In the early 1900s, this man became a convicted killer. When he spent time at Arkansas State Penitentiary on the prison farm, he was handed a gun and told to shoot any inmates trying to escape from the farm. Such were the times. He apparently shot and killed a few prisoners while maiming others. This job didn't really do much for his popularity in the prison. So when he later ended up in Alcatraz, you could say he didn't have the best of reputations among the prisoners. What's strange is that even with all those strict rules, it's said that other prisoners had many opportunities to bully Percival to the extreme. This is no doubt happening most of the time in the yard. Not only that, but the conditions of Alcatraz had a profound effect on Percival's mental well-being. He was beaten senseless whenever prisoners got close to him, and so the prison decided the best thing for him was to stay in the confinement cells. This made him the most guarded prisoner in Alcatraz. Then in 1936, he wrote a letter to James A. Johnston, the prison warden, and asked for a transfer. This was not forthcoming, and Percival was told he'd be staying in his solitary hell. No sooner than he got out of solitary, he managed to get his hands on a prison axe, which he used to cut off his fingers, apparently grinning like a madman as he did so. When he was finally diagnosed as being partially insane after complaining of seeing an alligator in his cell, but then after again being bullied and beaten badly at the prison, he was transferred. He later actually requested to be sent back to the hole at Alcatraz after getting beaten up in his new prison. As the story goes, he was beaten for the rest of his stay, but he was never arrested for committing a crime again after he got out. He died an old man in 1991. His story just goes to show how Alcatraz was designed not to rehabilitate but to break. Now we need to talk about a convicted killer and a bank robber named Henry Young. He was a violent man, becoming known as a bank robber who was quick to use extreme violence on hostages. He also became one of the biggest names that ever went through the doors at Alcatraz. There's a movie centered around him called Murder in the First, although the depiction of Young being a nice, non-violent guy is certainly not true in the slightest. Some things are true, though, such as this. On January 3, 1939, Young and 4 other prisoners named Arthur Barker, Rufus McCain, Dale Stamphill, and William Martin tried to escape. It didn't go too well for the criminal quintet, and Barker and Stamphill lost their lives after being shot. The movie also correctly depicts Young stabbing McCain less than a year later, causing an injury that proved to be fatal. He never said exactly why he did it, but his attorneys tried to fight his case by saying his time in solitary confinement had driven him to the edge of madness. Alcatraz found itself on trial. Young described his time in the hole, a period of months, not years, as the movie says. He wrote, "You are stripped nude and pushed into the cell. There's no soap, no tobacco, no toothbrush. You have no shoes, no bed, no mattress, nothing but the 4 damp walls and 2 blankets. The walls are painted black. Once a day, I got 3 slices of bread. No, that's an error. Some days I got 4 slices." This wasn't a good look for the authorities, although the jury ruled in favor of the prison when the case went to trial. The warden said the sadistic behavior that Young talked about just didn't happen. And a man named James V. Bennett, the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, wrote in 1941 that the awful conditions of Alcatraz were grossly exaggerated. Part of his long statement read, "I have visited Alcatraz frequently, as have various members of our staff, and know personally most of the inmates, including Young. As a matter of fact, I have on several occasions personally interviewed Young and done everything possible to obtain his cooperation. I've never found or had called to my attention any authentic case of brutality or inhumanity at Alcatraz." So, did Alcatraz really deserve the nickname of Hellcatraz? To answer that, we need to hear from more former prisoners, and there is no one better to ask than a man named Alvin "Creepy" Karpis. He was one of the many gangsters that came to the public eye during the Great Depression in the USA, although he was the only man of 4 that did enough crime to get himself in on the FBI's enemy #1 list. The others were the prolific criminals John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson. What makes Karpis stand out is that he was the only one of them to be captured and spend a long time in prison. In fact, his 26 years behind bars on the Rock made him the longest-serving Alcatraz prisoner of all time. Karpis wrote about some of the people he'd met in Alcatraz, saying that the legendary gangster Al Capone was often seen strumming his tenor banjo during recreation time. He called Machine Gun Kelly a big mouth and a compulsive liar, and said that the famed Birdman of Alcatraz was a total maniac. What's perhaps more surprising was his unlikely friendship with a man he described as mild-mannered, lazy, and shiftless. That man was none other than Charles Manson, whom Karpis taught to play guitar. This was the young Charles Manson, a good few years before he'd started his murderous cult, and according to some researchers might have been part of the CIA's MKUltra program. Karpis wrote of this kid who just couldn't stop getting himself arrested. The youngster's been in institutions all his life, first orphanages, then reformatories, and finally federal prison. His mother, a prostitute, was never around to look after him. I decided it's time someone did something for him, and to my surprise, he learns quickly. He has a pleasant voice and a pleasing personality, although he's unusually meek and mild for a convict. If that makes it sound like Alcatraz was a place where people sat around singing songs and having fun, Karpis wrote time and again about the brutality of the guards against people he believed had just a bad start in life. He summed up his 26 years by calling them an empty, futile experience. Karpis also talked about the riots, the day-to-day violence, the horrors of the hole, and some of those very violent escape attempts. But, as you already know, some of them ended with inmates as well as prison officers getting shot. But the question is, did anyone really come close to getting off that island? We can tell you that any attempt to do that had a significant effect on a man's life expectancy. Take, for instance, the time in 1938 when a bunch of men tried to escape during a prison workshop. That day, Officer Royal Klein had for a brief moment stopped watching the men to take an inventory of supplies in another room. When he returned to the main workshop, Thomas Limerick, James Lucas, and Rufus Whitey Franklin were in the midst of trying to get out the window. They attacked Klein with a hammer, which eventually led to his death. Their plan was to get to the roof and scale down the building where they believed they could get their hands on a police boat. But Officer Harold Stites got to them before that and opened fire. Limerick died, and both Lucas and Franklin were handed life sentences, as well as having to spend 6 years in the hole. Lucas is also famous for attacking Al Capone, with the reason being that Capone refused to take part in a prison strike. So again, when we consider this strike and the fact that prisoners were willing to risk their lives or life sentences to escape, you can be sure that some of them really believed that Alcatraz was a living hell. Both Lucas and Franklin were in for bank robbery and car theft, and had they not tried to escape, they might have left Alcatraz with much of their lives left to live. As it turns out, Franklin died a year after he got paroled in 1974. Lucas went on to work in the oil business after he got out in 1970. He died in 1988, age 86. The very first person who attempted to escape from Alcatraz was a prisoner named Joseph Bowers. 2 years after being sent to Alcatraz in 1934 for stealing some mail with a firearm in his hands, he ended up on the prison roof. As to why he was there will always remain a mystery, with some reports stating he was trying to get some food back that was stuck on some barbed wire. He apparently had been feeding the seagulls. But when the guard told him to get down, it seems Bowers didn't do as he was told. He was shot and fell 60 feet to the rocks below. There was no way he was surviving that. It was stated that Bowers had lost his mind with the incredibly strict confines of the prison. He also was described as a desperado and a loner, unable to come to terms with the conditions of Alcatraz, imprisoned during the toughest and most strict era. That's one thing to note. There were 4 wardens in total during the time that Alcatraz functioned as a prison, from 1934 to 1963, and some of them were way stricter than others. From 1934 to 1948, the warden was James Aloysius Johnston. Even though he was against barbarism, it's this guy that came up with the code of silence prisoners had to follow. He might have been against beatings, straitjackets, and other sadistic measures, but it seems his very strict disciplinarian attitude was too much for many inmates. 2 prisoners named Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe would have agreed. Both those guys were bank robbers, and before going to Alcatraz, they'd attempted to escape from another prison, hence the reason that they were sent to the supposedly escape-proof rock. In 1937, they hatched their plan, and then on December 16th, they decided it was time to go. The conditions were both good and bad for escape. Good because there was a thick fog that day over the bay, and bad because in December, the water is really cold. When a head count was taken at 1:30 p.m., it showed 2 people less than expected. It was soon evident that these 2 had sawn through their cell bars, scaled down a fence, and then forced open a gate with a wrench that they'd stolen from the workshop. The thing was, that dense fog made it possible for them to do this without anyone seeing them. Guards later found that wrench. They discovered footprints on the beach where they'd landed, but after a long and hard search they could not find the men. It was presumed that rather than make a raft of any sort, they'd use stolen canisters and tires as floats, both of which the men had worked with in the prison. But the tides at the time would have likely carried them into the Pacific Ocean, and anyway, even if they were expert swimmers, the 46 to 58 degree Fahrenheit water at that time of the year would have likely killed them. Over the years, the FBI didn't give up looking for the two men. There were some identifications now and again from the public and also a rumor they were living in South America, but if they did indeed survive, we'll never know. Others in time would also get into that water but not escape. So the question is it possible to swim the 1.5 miles to the nearest point to the bay shore? As many of you regular swimmers will know, that is hardly a long distance for a good swimmer. People often swim across the English Channel, which is 21 miles and 57 to 64 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Well, people do swim from Alcatraz to the shore, and they do it quite often. One website that talks about this great swim had this to say about it. Despite lore that swimming from Alcatraz is dangerous, for experienced swimmers with proper support, swimming from Alcatraz can be safe and fun. Okay, so these people often wear wetsuits, have a big meal in them prior to setting off, and have a bunch of folks around them who would help them if they got into trouble. But what if escapees were strong swimmers, healthy, well-fed, and maybe had some help with a raft? What if the conditions were pretty good the day they went? Let's also just recall here that the guards back in the day would have loved telling the story of all those great white sharks that inhabited the water close to Alcatraz. But truth be known, they very rarely swim that close to the island and would certainly be a long way down the list of any rational thinking prisoner's fears. Many people agree with the cold and the sometimes unpredictable movement of the water that you'd really have to be a good swimmer to get to the other side. Also, you wouldn't necessarily need a wetsuit. Many that swim it now don't bother with one. One of them just recently said this on a web forum: "Alcatraz is an extremely fun swim. I encourage anyone to do it." Still, he said that time your swim right or you could end up getting carried out to sea. Another swimmer who did it without a wetsuit said, "When I arrived to shore, it took me several seconds to get my legs to work as they were numb." He also said it was fun, but never again. And get this, in 1959, prisoner AZ-1403 did get to the shore on the other side. His name was John Paul Scott. He got all the way to Fort Point beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, but it seems the swim had done him in. A bunch of teenagers found him curled up in a ball suffering from hypothermia. Cops were on the scene in 20 minutes and he was soon back to Alcatraz. Apparently he wasn't such a great swimmer, but also had been helped a lot by a favorable tide. And this brings us arguably to the best Alcatraz story of them all. On June 11, 1962, there was an escape like no other. The men involved were Frank Morris, Alan West, and the brothers John and Clarence Anglin. Morris had spent much of his youth in prison, with crimes ranging from car theft to drug possession. He escaped from Louisiana State Penitentiary while doing time for bank robbery, and in 1960 he was sent to Alcatraz. Notably, his IQ was said to be 133 in the 98th percentile for IQs. For those of you who don't know what that means, it means only 2 out of 100 people have an IQ like his. John and Clarence Anglin were also career criminals, but it's said during their robberies they always made sure no one got hurt. They weren't violent criminals, just kids who'd grown up on the wrong side of the track. They also said that when they held up banks, they only ever used a toy gun. That didn't matter to the authorities, and they were handed lengthy sentences when caught. After some escape attempts at other prisons, they were subsequently sent to Alcatraz. Even more notable is that when these two were kids, both of them were said to be outstanding swimmers. Not only that, they at times astonished their friends by swimming great distances in Lake Michigan, when there was ice floating on the water. For these two, given conditions weren't totally against them, completing that Alcatraz escape swim would have been a breeze. The guy named Alan West was also involved in the escape, but he didn't get too far on the night it happened. In short, these men spent a lot of time using things such as spoons to dig out the cement in the walls where the vents were. They even fashioned a kind of drill they'd made from bits of a vacuum cleaner. When the drilling happened, someone played the accordion to mask the noise. Once they could get through the hole, they managed to walk through a corridor and set up their own workshop in a closed-off space. There, they used around 50 raincoats to make workable life preservers and even their very own 6 by 14-foot rubber raft. All this needed stitching and heating at the seams, which was a lot of work but possible with steam from vents. It also took a fair amount of intelligence, which they all seemed to have. And when they were working and missing from their beds, it wasn't a problem because they'd made dummies to put under the blankets replete with painted human-looking papier-mâché heads. If you're wondering how the hell they blew up vests in a raft, they modified an accordion and used it as a pump. But on the night they left, West discovered to his disbelief that some of the cement he'd used around his vent had gotten too hard. He had to stay behind, but the rest of them took their equipment and scaled down to the beach. That was it. They were gone. And because of their dummy heads, the alarm wasn't raised until the next morning. With pie now in its face, the FBI ended up finding some personal effects and possible bits of the raft and life jackets. But there was no sign of any bodies, and remember, these guys could swim. It was also June, not the worst time to be in the water, even if the prison purposefully made the shower water hot so the men couldn't get used to cold water. The FBI kept on looking for them and didn't close the case until 1979. Again, there had been sightings and lots of rumors of them being alive, but they drifted from the public consciousness. Then in 2013, the FBI got a letter. They didn't make it public for 5 years, though. Part of it read, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." It said Morris died in 2008 and Clarence in 2011. He also stated, "If you announce on TV that I will be promised to just go to jail for no more than a year and get some medical attention, I will write back to let you know where exactly I am. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer." The FBI didn't bother with a reply, so we have no idea if the letter was real. But what's more shocking is what two nephews of the Anglin brothers later said. They are Ken and David Widner. In 2016, they told The Guardian they knew the brothers had survived. They say they had documents that proved their escape was successful, including a photo. They also said they have a bad relationship with the FBI and U.S. Marshals after years of harassment. They disbelieve that Clarence and John's brother was electrocuted while trying to escape Kilby Correctional Facility years later after the brothers had left Alcatraz. Instead, they say he was probably beaten to death during an interrogation because he knew where the brothers were. They knew he knew where they were, David Widner has said, and the family really believed they beat him to death trying to get him to tell them where these boys were. One thing that is undeniable is men would literally risk death to get out of that prison, even if the authorities often played down how bad it was inside. But when it did close in 1963, it wasn't because of human rights abuses. But the fact was it was too expensive to keep it open. Now you need to watch a show about one of Alcatraz's most famous prisoners in Machine Gun Kelly, The Life and Crimes of Public Enemy No. 1. Or have a look at possibly the craziest prisoner ever, and Man So Violent Even Other Prisoners Fear Him.